The day his daughter was born, he left. Not because he had to, because he forgot he had a choice. Almost none of it matters. Not the inbox, not the meeting, not the 17 priorities on the list. Almost none of it. You're not choosing between good and bad. You're choosing between good and what actually matters. That gap is your entire life. Imagine you only get 20 investment decisions for your whole life. What would you actually choose? Apple's founder crossed 7 off the list of 10. Not deprioritized, gone. That decision built the most valuable company in history.
She wasn't fearless, she was clear. And clarity, real clarity, is the only thing that makes courage possible. She said the ritual isn't the workout, the ritual is the cab.
Broadway.
The moment she gets in, the work is already done.
By the time he reached the starting blocks, every decision had already been made. That's not talent, that's the design.
Divided attention isn't a small thing. It's a statement. And everyone in the room hears it, whether you meant to say it or not.
The meeting did not matter to anyone. His wife noticed everything. He never forgot the difference again.
What is essential? Eliminate everything else. That's the whole book. That's the whole life.
Episode 1, The Invincible Power of Choice. You said yes again today. You don't even remember what. Somewhere between the 7th meeting and the 2nd deadline, you stopped choosing your life and started just reacting to it. Please stay with me for the next hour, because by the end of it, you'll understand exactly why that happens and exactly what it costs you when it does. Let's start with a single Friday in California, because everything in this book and everything in this series traces back to it. A young man named Greg McKeown is sitting in a hospital room. His wife, Anna, is exhausted beside him. Their daughter was born hours earlier. He is, by every reasonable definition, exactly where he is supposed to be. His phone buzzes. A colleague needs him at a client meeting. Today. Not tomorrow. Today. He goes. He spends the first day of his daughter's life moving between two worlds that should never have been allowed to touch. Phone in one hand, his newborn barely an hour old in the other, vacillating, as he would later put it, unable to truly give his full attention to either one. He attends the meeting. He answers emails in the waiting room. He drives back to the hospital. And when it's over, his manager says something that was meant as a compliment: the client will respect you for the choice you just made. McKeown wasn't so sure. In his own words, years later, it's clear I made a bad trade-off. I violated something essential for something non-essential. That sentence is the seed of everything you're about to hear for the next 12 episodes. Not because it's a dramatic story, it isn't, really. No one was hurt. No catastrophe followed. The meeting, by McKeown's own account, turned out to matter to almost no one. That's exactly the point. He gave away something irreplaceable for something that, in the end, was worth almost nothing. And he did it without ever consciously deciding to. The request arrived. He said yes. The yes felt automatic, almost involuntary, the way breathing is involuntary, the way flinching is involuntary. That's the disease this whole series is trying to name and cure, the slow, invisible surrender of your own choices to other people's urgency. Here's a phrase you'll hear repeated throughout this series, because McKeown repeats it constantly, and for good reason: if you don't prioritize your own life, someone else will prioritize it for you. 1. Not maliciously. Not even consciously, most of the time. Your inbox doesn't hate you. Your calendar doesn't have an agenda. But left unchecked, both of them will happily consume 100% of your time, energy, and attention, because neither one was built with your priorities in mind. They were built to be filled. So who was this man before the hospital room, before any of this had a name? McKeown studied at Brigham Young University, then earned an MBA from Stanford's Graduate School of Business, completing it in 2008. While there, He stumbled onto something that would eventually become the spine of his entire career, a strange, specific kind of suffering unique to high achievers. He called it, borrowing a phrase that was just starting to enter the cultural vocabulary, the fear of missing out FOMO. He first noticed it at business school itself. As he put it, there are so many good things happening here that you will constantly be thinking about all the other things you could be doing. Every event, every club, every networking dinner, every speaker series, all of it is legitimately valuable, all of it competing for the same finite hours. What McKeown discovered next is the actual engine of this entire book, and it deserves to be said clearly, because it's counterintuitive enough that people miss it on a first read. The problem he kept finding, again and again, in company after company, wasn't failure. It was a success. Let that sit for a second, because it doesn't make intuitive sense at first. Why would success be dangerous? Here's the mechanism. McKeown spent years working directly with executive teams inside Silicon Valley's most admired companies. And what he saw, repeatedly, was this pattern: a team finds early traction. They do one or two things extraordinarily well. That early excellence generates attention, new partnerships, new markets, acquisition offers, press coverage, and prestigious clients. Suddenly, the team that built its identity around doing a few things brilliantly is being pulled in 15 directions by the very success that one or two of those things created. The team says yes to the new partnership because saying no to an opportunity feels insane when you're finally winning. They say yes to the new market because growth is supposed to be good. They say yes to the acquisition conversation because what kind of founder turns down that kind of attention? And piece by piece, the focus that built the company in the first place gets quietly dismantled by the company's own success. McKeown spent 15 years circling a single question because of what he saw in these rooms: why is it that capable people and capable teams don't break through to the next level? The answer he kept arriving at wasn't a lack of talent, or a lack of resources, or a lack of opportunity. If anything, these teams had too much opportunity. The answer was a lack of discipline in saying no to all but the very best of it. This is where the title of the book actually comes from. McKeown isn't talking about minimalism for its own sake. He isn't telling you to own fewer things or live in a smaller apartment, although some essentialists might choose that. He's describing a discipline, a repeated, conscious practice of distinguishing the vital few activities from the trivial many and then having the courage to eliminate, delegate, or decline almost everything that falls into that second category. Most of us live as what McKeown calls non-essentialists, and it's worth sitting in that mirror for a moment, because almost everyone recognizes themselves here at least partially. The non-essentialist's default posture toward the world is, I have to. I have to go to this meeting. I have to answer this message tonight. I have to say yes to this favor. Everything arrives pre-labeled as an obligation, regardless of whether it actually is one. The essentialist's posture is different in a single, deceptively small way: I choose to. Not, I have to attend. I choose to attend, because right now, this is genuinely the best use of my finite time. And the inverse is just as important: I choose not to, instead of the apologetic, guilt-soaked, I can't, that most of us default to when we're declining something. That tiny linguistic shift carries enormous weight, because language shapes how we experience our own lives. I have to positions you as a passenger. I choose to positions you as the driver. And McKeown's entire argument rests on a single, almost embarrassingly simple foundational claim: you were always the driver. You just handed the wheel to someone else, one small, reasonable-sounding yes at a time. Let's make this concrete. McKeown tells the story, early in the book, of an executive he calls Sam, and it's worth saying plainly, because honesty matters here, that Sam is a pseudonym. McKeown changed the name to protect the man's privacy, and this is telling you that directly rather than presenting Sam as a verified real name. But the pattern Sam represents is one you have almost certainly lived in some form, even if the specific details differ. Sam is a capable, well-regarded executive in Silicon Valley. His company gets acquired by a larger, slower, more bureaucratic organization. Almost overnight, the informal, nimble culture he thrived in gets replaced by layers of process and competing stakeholders, all of whom now have access to his calendar. And because Sam is good at his job, because he's always been the person who says yes, who steps up, who can be counted on, the requests multiply. He's pulled into a dozen different initiatives. He's making what McKeown describes as a millimeter of progress in a million directions. His performance, ironically, begins to slip, even as his hours climb. He's busier than he's ever been and accomplishing less than he ever has. He starts seriously considering quitting. He updates his resume. And then, almost by accident, a mentor asks him one reframing question that changes the entire trajectory. What would happen if you only did the things you would do if you had just been brought in, from outside, as a highly paid consultant hired specifically to fix this place? It's a strange, almost magical question because it does something most advice doesn't do. It gives permission. A consultant brought in to fix a company doesn't attend every meeting out of politeness. A consultant doesn't say yes to every favor out of guilt. A consultant has one job: find the highest leverage work and do that, relentlessly, while declining almost everything else. Sam starts applying that lens to his own role. Carefully, at first testing the waters, declining one or two things, and watching to see if the world ends. It doesn't. He declines a few more. Still nothing collapses. In fact, something unexpected starts happening. People respect him more, not less. The clarity of his focus becomes, paradoxically, more impressive than his previous willingness to do everything ever was. This is the first major insight worth carrying forward into the rest of this series. Discipline about your own time isn't perceived by others as selfishness, most of the time. It's perceived as competence. The people who are hardest to pin down for a meeting are very often the people whose time is understood to be most valuable. Scarcity, real or perceived, creates respect. Constant availability, oddly, tends to erode it. We're going to come back to Sam's story later in this episode, because there's a second layer to it that matters even more than the first. But first, McKeown gives this entire phenomenon a name, and it's precise enough that it's worth sitting with carefully, because once you see it, you'll start noticing it everywhere in your own career, in the careers of people you admire, and in companies you've watched rise and then quietly lose their way. He calls it the clarity paradox, and he lays it out in 4 predictable phases, in his own words, published in the Harvard Business Review. Phase 1, when you have real clarity of purpose, it leads to success. You know exactly what you're for, and that focus produces results. Phase 2, when you have success, you gain a reputation. People start to see you as the go-to person, the reliable one, the team or the individual who delivers. That reputation is, in itself, a kind of currency. Phase 3, that reputation generates more options and opportunities than you had before. More requests. More invitations. More doors are held open for you that weren't open a year earlier. Phase 4, and this is the phase that quietly destroys people. These increased options and opportunities lead to diffused efforts. You can't do justice to all of them. You spread yourself across more and more commitments, and the same clarity that built your success in the first place gets slowly, invisibly dismantled by the success itself. McKeown's own phrase for the conclusion is almost paradoxical on its face, and he says it directly: success can be a catalyst for failure. Not despite the success. Because of it. He's not the only person to notice this pattern, and it's worth naming the others, because this isn't one author's pet theory. It's something multiple serious researchers of organizational behavior have converged on independently. The respected management researcher Jim Collins, in his book, How the Mighty Fall, studied companies that had been Wall Street darlings and later collapsed. Collins found that one of the recurring causes of that collapse wasn't bad luck or a single catastrophic decision. It was what he called the undisciplined pursuit of more companies that, having found one thing that worked spectacularly, couldn't resist chasing every adjacent opportunity that success then made available to them until the original thing that worked got buried under a dozen things that didn't. McKeown's antidote, stated as simply as he can manage it, is not just haphazardly saying no when you happen to feel overwhelmed, but purposefully, deliberately, and strategically eliminating the non-essential not once a year during some planning offsite, but constantly, as an ongoing discipline. And critically, being willing to cut not just the obvious time wasters but genuinely excellent opportunities too if they don't serve the vital few things you've already decided matter most. That's the harder version of this discipline, and it's the version that actually works. Anyone can say no to a bad opportunity. The real test of an essentialist is saying no to a good one. There's a real-world echo of this that McKeown points to directly. Herb Kelleher, the co-founder of Southwest Airlines, became known for a specific and famous stubbornness. Through years of competitors adding meals, assigned seating, and first-class cabins, Kelleher refused, again and again, to dilute Southwest's offering with services that didn't serve its one essential identity, the cheapest, simplest, most reliable way to get from one city to another. We'll come back to that story in more detail later in this episode. Before we return to Sam, I want to take you somewhere completely different to McKeown's own law school years, because the story he tells about himself is, in some ways, more revealing than anything he tells about his clients. He had done what a great many capable, ambitious young people do. He enrolled in law school, not because he had any burning desire to practice law, but because it felt like the responsible thing to do, a credential that would keep his options open, a path that looked sensible from the outside regardless of whether it matched anything he actually wanted. One evening, sitting with the question honestly for what may have been the first time, he realized something almost embarrassingly simple: law school had never actually been on his list of things he wanted to pursue. Not once. He had simply never stopped to ask the question directly, so the path had been chosen for him by inertia, by other people's expectations, and by the comforting fiction that keeping doors open is the same thing as making good decisions. It isn't. Keeping every door open is its own choice, usually a bad one, dressed up as the absence of a choice at all. That realization is the emotional and intellectual seed of the entire book you're listening to right now. We always have a choice. The danger isn't that the choice gets taken from us by some external force. The danger is that we fail to recognize it as a choice at all, and so we drift, accumulating a life built entirely out of other people's defaults. Picture a dog in a small box. Decades ago, two researchers named Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer ran an experiment that would end up, indirectly, shaping the central argument of the book this series is built on. Dogs were divided into groups. One group received mild electric shocks that they could stop by pressing a lever. A second group received the same shocks on the same schedule, but their lever did nothing no matter what they did, the shock came and went on its own. A third group received no shocks at all. Later, all three groups were placed in a new box, one with a low divider they could easily jump over to escape the shocked side entirely. The dogs who'd had a working lever earlier jumped the divider immediately. So did the dogs who'd never been shocked. But the dogs who had learned, through repeated experience, that nothing they did mattered, those dogs didn't jump. They lay down. They whimpered. They simply absorbed the shock, even though the escape was sitting right there in front of them, completely available. Seligman and Meyer called this learned helplessness, and it's one of the most replicated findings in behavioral psychology. The dogs hadn't lost the physical ability to jump. They'd lost something else, the belief that jumping would matter. And once that belief was gone, the actual presence of an open door became irrelevant. They'd stopped looking for doors at all. McKeown takes this finding and applies it somewhere it might initially seem like a stretch to ordinary, successful, capable people, sitting in ordinary offices, who have never been shocked by anything more dramatic than a difficult boss or an overloaded inbox. And yet the pattern, he argues, is recognizably the same. You take on one more task you didn't have room for, because saying no last time felt awkward and nothing terrible happened, so you assume nothing terrible will happen this time either, except you're now even more stretched than before. You absorb one more unreasonable deadline. One more weekend sacrificed. One more, just this once, that quietly becomes the new normal. And at some point nobody can tell you exactly when, because it never happens in one dramatic moment you stop noticing that you ever had a lever at all. You start describing your own choices using the language of whether. I had to. There was no other option. What else could I do? There was an option. There almost always is. You just stopped checking for it. Here's the part of McKeown's argument that's easy to miss on a first read, and it might be the single most important reframe in this entire episode. Learned helplessness doesn't only show up in the people who do nothing. It shows up just as completely in the people who say yes to everything. That sounds backwards at first. The overcommit, frantically busy person seems like the opposite of someone who's given up. But look closer. If you say yes to every request without exception, you're not actually exercising choice at all. You've simply outsourced the decision to whoever happens to ask. The calendar fills itself. Your day gets decided by other people's urgency, not by your own deliberate judgment. Frantic overfunctioning and passive underfunctioning are, McKeown argues, the same disease wearing two different costumes. Both are a surrender of the one thing that was never actually taken from you, the ability to choose. This is why McKeown insists, almost stubbornly, on a particular distinction: choice is not the same thing as options. Your options can absolutely be limited by circumstances outside your control: your finances, your health, your family obligations, and the realities of the economy you happen to be living through. McKeown isn't pretending those constraints don't exist, and it would be dishonest of this documentary to imply otherwise. But within whatever options you do have, however narrow, the act of choosing among them is something nobody can take from you except by your own forgetting. He puts it almost like a definition: a choice is not a thing. It's an action. It's something you do over and over, moment by moment, not a possession you either have or don't have. Now let's go back to Rosa Parks, because the way McKeown tells this story is more layered than the version most people already know, and the added layer matters enormously for this episode's argument. Most people's mental image of Rosa Parks is of someone naturally fearless, a born activist who simply refused, as if defiance were her default setting. McKeown complicates that picture in a way that actually strengthens his point rather than weakening it. Parks, by her own description and by multiple historical accounts, was not naturally outspoken. She had, on more than one occasion before that December evening, declined opportunities to take on more visible, more confrontational roles. She'd been hesitant, even, about accepting a position as secretary of her local NAACP chapter, a far less dangerous ask than what would come later. This is the detail that matters. The woman who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus in December of 1955 was not someone for whom defiance came naturally or easily. She was, by most accounts, a quiet, careful person who had spent years being cautious. And on that particular evening, asked to give up her seat one more time in a system designed to make refusal feel impossible, something in her reached a point of clarity that she could no longer talk herself out of. She said no, not because she transformed into a different kind of person overnight, but because the choice she'd always technically had finally became, for her, undeniable. McKeown's argument here is narrow, and it's worth stating precisely, because the comparison between a civil rights milestone and a productivity framework can sound, if handled carelessly, almost offensive. The claim isn't that an executive declining a meeting is morally equivalent to a woman risking arrest to challenge segregation. It isn't. The claim is structural and much smaller than that. Even inside a system explicitly built to make you feel like refusal isn't an option, the capacity to choose remains, technically, intact. What collapses, for most of us, most of the time, isn't the option to choose. We believe that we still have one. There's a second example McKeown reaches for that operates on a much smaller, more domestic scale, and it might actually be more useful to you personally than the Rosa Parks story, precisely because it's so ordinary. It involves Stephen Covey, the author best known for The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Covey had made a promise to his daughter, a small, specific commitment, the kind of promise that's easy to deprioritize when something more socially exciting comes along. And something more exciting did come along. An old friend, in town unexpectedly, invited him to dinner that same evening. Covey said no to the old friend. Not because the friend didn't matter, and not without real internal discomfort by most accounts. It cost him something socially to decline. But he'd committed to his daughter first, and he honored it, even though nobody would have blamed him for rearranging his evening around the more flattering, more spontaneous invitation. McKeown's point in including this story isn't that you should always choose your children over your friends, or that every commitment carries equal weight. The point is narrower and more useful than that. Courage is the precondition for everything else in this book. You can understand discernment perfectly. You can master the 90% rule. You can know, with total clarity, which few things are essential in your life. None of that matters if you don't have the nerve, in the actual moment, to say no to the thing that's merely good in favor of the thing you've already decided is essential. Clarity without courage is just an unused map. Let's return now to Sam, the Silicon Valley executive from earlier in this episode, because there's a second layer to his story that we deliberately held back until now, and it connects directly to everything you've just heard. Sam's first round of no's worked. People respected his new clarity rather than resenting it. But McKeown is careful not to present this as a tidy, one-time fix, because that's not how it actually played out, and it's not how it plays out for most people who attempt this shift. Sam's old instincts didn't disappear. They resurfaced, repeatedly, especially whenever a new request arrived dressed up as flattering a high-profile project, a visible opportunity, the kind of ask that triggers exactly the fear of missing out McKeown identified back at Stanford. Saying no to a boring, obviously low-value request is relatively easy. Saying no to a genuinely exciting one, repeatedly, over years, is the actual skill, and it's a skill that has to be relearned, in some form, again and again, because the temptation never fully goes away. That's not a discouraging note to end this part on. It's an honest one. Essentialism, as McKeown describes it, was never a single decision you make once and then coast on forever. It's closer to physical fitness than to a diploma, something you maintain through repeated practice, something that atrophies the moment you stop exercising it, something you'll have to choose again tomorrow regardless of how well you chose today. You have a lever. You've probably had it the whole time. The question this episode is leaving you with, heading into its final part, is simple, and it's the same question Rosa Parks effectively answered on a Montgomery bus and the same one Stephen Covey answered at his own kitchen table. When the moment actually arrives, will you remember that the lever is there? Let's bring this episode home with 3 more real examples, because abstractions only take you so far, and McKeown himself leans heavily on concrete cases to make his point land. Start with a question McKeown began asking executive teams directly, in real consulting rooms, because he kept noticing how badly most teams answered it. The question was simple: what question are you actually trying to answer here? He posed it to one struggling team and was met with an awkward silence. Nobody had a response ready. Someone changed the subject. He asked again. And again. Eventually, the team stopped deflecting and actually sat with the discomfort of not knowing, until they worked out, together, what decision genuinely needed to be made and what they were trying to accomplish by making it. That pause, that willingness to sit in not knowing rather than rushing toward false clarity, is, in McKeown's view, where almost all good strategic thinking actually begins. Most teams skip it entirely, because silence in a meeting feels like failure, so someone fills it with motion instead of insight. Out of that kind of clarifying work comes something McKeown calls an essential intent, and it's worth understanding precisely what he means by the phrase, because it's more specific than an ordinary mission statement. Most organizations have mission statements. Most of them are vague enough to be functionally useless, inspiring in tone, but impossible to act on, impossible to measure, and impossible to use as an actual filter for daily decisions. An essential intent, by contrast, has to be both inspirational and concrete at the same time, meaningful and measurable in the same sentence. McKeown points to an example that genuinely meets that bar. After Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, the actor Brad Pitt, frustrated by how little progress was being made on rebuilding, founded an organization called Make It Right. Its essential intent wasn't something vague like, help New Orleans recover. It was precise: build 150 affordable, green, storm-resistant homes for families living in the lower 9th Ward. Notice what that sentence does. It's inspiring, you can feel the human stakes behind it. But it's also brutally concrete. You will know, with total clarity, whether you succeeded or failed, because the number is right there in the sentence. 150 homes. Not as many as we can. Not a meaningful number. 150. Now, in the interest of honesty, this documentary has tried to maintain throughout, it's worth telling you what happened next, because McKeown's book written in 2014 couldn't have known how the story would continue. In the years since, Make It Right's actual homes ran into serious, well-documented problems. A number of them deteriorated badly, several were later demolished for safety reasons, and the foundation faced lawsuits and significant criticism over construction quality. That doesn't erase the value of McKeown's narrower point. A concrete, measurable intent genuinely does sharpen decision-making in a way vague mission statements never can. But it would be dishonest to use this example without acknowledging that clarity of intent, on its own, doesn't guarantee good execution. The two are related but separate disciplines, and we'll spend real time on execution later in this series. Let's turn to a cleaner, more durable example of the same underlying principle: Apple, under Steve Jobs, after his return to the company in the late 1990s. There's a well-known practice attributed to Jobs during that period, gathering his team and asking them to identify the 10 things the company should be doing next and then, deliberately, crossing off the bottom 7. Not deprioritizing them quietly. Crossing them off. Removing them from consideration entirely. That single habit, repeated again and again across years, took a company that had been weeks from bankruptcy and turned it into one of the most valuable businesses in the history of commerce, not by doing more things, but by refusing, in public, repeatedly, to do almost everything else that crossed its desk. Contrast that with a story McKeown tells from his own consulting work, which we touched on briefly in an earlier episode but is worth returning to here, because the contrast with Apple is so stark. An executive team he was working with was asked to name its top 5 priorities for the coming year. One manager on that team couldn't get her list below 18 items. After real, sustained pressure, she brought it down to 17. 17 top priorities are not a list of priorities. It's a confession, dressed up as a plan, that nothing on the list is actually being prioritized at all. Compare that instinct to jobs crossing off 7 of 10 without flinching, and you start to see exactly what separates organizations and individuals who break through from those who stay permanently, exhaustingly stuck. One more case, because the pattern deserves to be seen from a third angle before this episode closes. Herb Kelleher, co-founder of Southwest Airlines, whom we mentioned briefly in part 1. Through years of watching competitor airlines add meals, assigned seating, premium cabins, and elaborate loyalty programs, Kelleher held a single, stubborn line. Southwest wouldn't chase any of it. The decision looked, to outside observers at various points, like self-sabotage. No assigned seats meant boarding looked chaotic compared to competitors. No meals meant the airline seemed cheap by comparison. But the trade-off was deliberate, and it was in service of one essential identity, being the simplest, fastest, most reliably affordable way to get from one city to another, full stop. When rival airlines later tried to copy elements of Southwest's low-cost model without making the same uncomfortable trade-offs, Continental's short-lived, Continental Light, being the most often cited example, those imitators struggled and largely abandoned the experiment within a few years. 24. You can't borrow the result of a trade-off without making the actual trade. That's true of an airline's entire business strategy, and it's just as true of your Tuesday afternoon. Let's bring this all the way back to where we started, to a hospital room, on a single Friday, with a phone buzzing beside a newborn daughter. McKeown didn't fail that day because he was a careless father or a bad husband. He failed because, for one specific, identifiable hour, he forgot he had a lever. The request arrived dressed as an obligation, and rather than pausing to ask whether it actually was one, he treated it as though it were. That's the trap this entire episode has been circling. Almost nothing that demands your immediate yes is actually an obligation in the way it presents itself. Most of it is a request wearing an obligation's clothing, and the only person positioned to see through that costume, in the actual moment it matters, is you. None of the people in this episode, not McKeown, not Sam, not Rosa Parks, not even Steve Jobs, fixed everything in one dramatic decision. That's not how this discipline works, and any documentary that told you otherwise would be selling you something false. What they share instead is smaller, slower, and more durable, a willingness to notice, again and again, in moment after ordinary moment, that the choice in front of them was actually theirs. And then to choose deliberately. And then to do it again the next day, when the temptation to drift back into, I have to, inevitably returned, because it always does. That's the whole discipline, stripped down to its foundation. Not a single transformation. 1,000 small, reclaimed choices, compounding quietly, until one day you look up and realize you're living a life you actually selected, rather than one that simply happened to you. You said yes again today. But somewhere in the last hour, you started noticing yourself doing it. And that noticing, that half-second pause before the automatic yes, is where everything else in this series actually begins. Episode 2, The Unimportance of Practically Everything. Here's a sentence that will save you more time than any productivity app you'll ever download. Almost none of it matters. Not the inbox. Not the calendar invite. Not the 18 browser tabs open on your laptop right now. Most of what fills your day isn't important, it just feels urgent. And urgency, McKeown would argue, is the most convincing liar you'll ever meet. In the last episode, you learned that you always have a choice, even when it doesn't feel like it. This episode answers the next, harder question, a choice about what, exactly? If you've reclaimed the wheel, where do you actually point the car? That's what discernment is for. And McKeown opens this part of the book with a phrase that's almost insulting in how directly it states the problem. A non-essentialist believes that almost everything is essential. An essentialist believes that almost everything is non-essential. Same world. Same number of hours in the day. Completely different filter for deciding what deserves them. Let's go back, briefly, to a quiet observation made over a century ago, because it's the intellectual foundation on which everything in this episode rests. In the early 1900s, an Italian economist named Vilfredo Pareto noticed something strange while studying land ownership in his own country. Roughly 20% of the population controlled around 80% of the land. Curious, he kept looking elsewhere, at wealth distribution, at production output, at almost any complex system he could measure, and kept finding the same lopsided ratio again and again. Not exactly 80-20 every time, but close enough, often enough, that it started to look less like a coincidence and more like a pattern built into the structure of complex systems themselves. Decades later, a quality control engineer named Joseph Uran took that observation and sharpened it into something genuinely actionable. He called it the law of the vital few. A small number of causes produce the overwhelming majority of effects. In a factory, that meant something specific and useful. Find the handful of defect categories responsible for most of your quality problems, fix those, and you've solved most of the problems. Chase the other, longer list of minor defects with equal urgency, and you're burning resources on noise that barely moves the needle. McKeown takes that industrial insight and points it directly at your actual life. 20% of your meetings probably produce 80% of your useful decisions. 20% of your relationships likely account for most of your genuine joy. And here's the one that tends to sting on a first hearing: 20% of your tasks today are doing nearly all of the real work. The other 80% is motion without meaningful progress. But McKeown doesn't stop at 80-20, and this is where the chapter gets genuinely uncomfortable if you let it. He pushes the idea a layer deeper. Even within your vital 20%, there's a smaller, more concentrated core, still something closer to 1% that's doing almost all of the heavy lifting. The essentialist isn't satisfied with finding the important fifth of their life. They keep narrowing, asking again and again, even of their good options, which of these, specifically, is the one that changes everything. This matters because of a trap that catches ambitious, talented people more than anyone else. Most of what you'd proudly call important work this week isn't actually essential, it's merely good. It's defensible. You could explain it in a performance review without embarrassment, and nobody would question it. But good and essential are not the same word, and confusing the two is, in McKeown's view, the single most common way capable people waste not just a week, but an entire decade. Here's the trap stated even more precisely, because it cuts against something most of us were taught from childhood: more effort does not reliably produce more results. For a while, it absolutely does. Your first focused hours on a problem correlate well with genuine output. But past a certain point, that curve flattens, sometimes sharply. You can pour twice the hours into the wrong 80% of your task list and walk away with almost nothing extra to show for it. Less, but better, beats more, but scattered, far more often than our culture's instincts would have you believe. So how, practically, do you find that vital few, or that vital 1% in the middle of an ordinary, busy, demanding life? McKeown's answer surprises people because it isn't a productivity hack at all. It's the opposite of productivity, in the conventional sense. You have to create space to think. That sounds almost laughably simple, and it is simple, which is precisely why most people skip it. McKeown's diagnosis is blunt: non-essentialists believe they are too busy to think about their lives. They're caught in a self-reinforcing trap, too overwhelmed to stop and unable to stop being overwhelmed because they never created the space to figure out what to cut. Essentialists, by contrast, treat thinking time not as a luxury to be squeezed in if there's leftover time, but as a non-negotiable input, scheduled deliberately and protected the way you protect any other essential commitment. This is harder than it sounds in a culture that treats busyness as a badge of honor. Tell someone you're slammed this week, and you'll get sympathy, even quiet admiration. Tell someone you spent the afternoon thinking, no deliverable, no meeting, nothing to show for it on paper, and you're more likely to get a raised eyebrow. But that unstructured thinking time is precisely where discernment actually happens. It cannot compete with a notification. It cannot survive a packed calendar. It has to be defended, deliberately, the way you defend any other priority you actually believed in. McKeown offers a specific lens for this kind of thinking, borrowed from a profession built entirely around figuring out what actually matters in a flood of information: journalism. Think like an investigative journalist looking at the raw material of your own life. A good journalist doesn't report every fact they encounter. They search for the lead, the one detail that the entire story actually hinges on, and they let almost everything else fall away as background noise. He opens this part of the book with a story from the journalist and filmmaker Nora Ephron, who described being taught this lesson directly, early in her career, by a high school journalism teacher. The class was given the same basic assignment most beginning journalism students get: write a lead paragraph based on a simple set of facts about an upcoming school event, speakers, a date, a location, and routine details. Most of the students did exactly what you'd expect. They reorganized the facts into a slightly tighter paragraph, listing the who, what, when, and where in roughly the order they'd been given. Their teacher returned every single one of those papers with the same single word at the top: no. Then he told them the actual lead. Among the facts buried in that list of routine details was one line nobody had thought twice about: the high school's principal was named as one of the scheduled speakers. The real story, the actual lead, was that the school had announced there would be no school next Thursday because the entire faculty was attending a teaching conference. That fact had been sitting right there in the assignment the whole time, indistinguishable from all the other facts, until someone with real discernment understood that everything else in that list was secondary to it. That's the skill McKeown is asking you to develop, applied to your own days instead of a newspaper assignment. Most of what's competing for your attention right now looks, on the surface, identical in importance to everything around it, just another item in a flat, undifferentiated list. The discipline isn't gathering more facts. It's developing the judgment to recognize the way that journalism students eventually learn, which single fact, actually, changes everything. A non-essentialist, faced with two genuinely good options, instinctively asks, how can I do both? It feels responsible. It feels like ambition, like refusing to settle. McKeown argues it's actually a quiet form of self-deception, because the honest answer, almost every time, is that you can't, not for long. The essentialist asks a harder, more useful question instead: not how can I do both, but which problem do I want? That reframe matters more than it might sound like it should. Every meaningful choice you'll ever make comes bundled with its own specific set of problems. The demanding job that pays well comes with the problem of less time. The deep relationship comes with the problem of real vulnerability. The bold business bet comes with the problem of genuine risk. You are never actually choosing between a problem and no problem. There is no version of your life with zero problems in it. You're choosing which problem you'd rather wake up to for the next several years. Once you accept that framing, something shifts. The question stops being, what do I have to give up, which feels like loss, and becomes, what do I want to go big on, which feels like direction. McKeown is explicit that this is a small linguistic shift with a large cumulative effect over time. Let's make this concrete with the case McKeown himself returns to repeatedly, because it's one of the clearest real-world illustrations of a trade-off made on purpose, sustained over decades, at the scale of an entire company, Southwest Airlines. Rather than trying to fly to every destination the way a traditional full-service carrier would, Southwest deliberately chose to offer only point-to-point flights, skipping the centralized hub-and-spoke model most competitors relied on. Instead of raising prices to cover the cost of in-flight meals, they decided to serve none. Instead of assigning seats in advance, the standard, expected practice, they let passengers choose their own seats as they boarded. Instead of upselling premium, first-class service, they offered economy seating only, full stop. Each of those decisions, taken individually, looks like the airline removing value. Taken together, they're the opposite: a coherent, deliberate strategy built entirely around being unambiguously, defensively the best in the world at exactly one thing: low-cost, reliable, point-to-point travel. Every no made the yes sharper. When rival carriers later tried to copy pieces of that model without committing to the same trade-offs, the results were telling. Continental Airlines launched an internal offering called Continental Light, attempting to match Southwest's low fares and quick turnarounds while still keeping the assigned seating, the meals, and the broader route network that Southwest had deliberately abandoned. The hybrid approach underperformed badly and was discontinued within a few years. You cannot borrow the result of a trade-off without making the actual trade. Half measures don't get you half the benefit, they often get you none of it, while costing you the clarity you'd have had either way. McKeown's blunt conclusion, stated almost as a warning, is that we can try to avoid the reality of trade-offs, but we can't actually escape them. Every non-decision is itself a decision, usually the worst available one, because it gets made by default rather than by design. There's a version of this same idea applied to personal life that McKeown tells through Warren Buffett, returning to a figure we met briefly through Charlie Munger's 1994 commencement story. By Buffett's own accounting, The overwhelming majority of his net worth, something like 90% of it, can be traced back to a remarkably small number of investment decisions, often cited as around 10, made across an investing career spanning decades. Thousands of opportunities crossed his desk over those years. He acted decisively on a tiny fraction of them, and those few decisions did almost all the work. That's not survivorship bias dressed up as wisdom, it's the direct, lived consequence of the 20-slot punch card discipline from earlier in this series. Concentrate ruthlessly on the rare, unambiguous opportunities. Let everything else pass by without regret, because chasing all of it would have diluted the few bets that actually mattered. Creating the actual space to make these kinds of deliberate trade-offs requires more than an internal mindset shift. It requires literal, protected time, carved out of a calendar that will not protect itself. McKeown describes a personal practice he calls a quarterly offsite, not a corporate retreat, just a recurring block of unstructured time, the first Monday of every month, where phones and email get turned off entirely. No agenda. No deliverable. Just space. His reasoning for why this can't be optional: if you're too busy to think, you're too busy, period. Space for this kind of reflection only comes by deliberate design. It will never simply appear on its own, because every other claim on your calendar will always feel more urgent in the moment than time spent thinking about nothing in particular. He offers a smaller, daily scale version of the same principle that anyone can start immediately, regardless of how packed their schedule already is. Spend the first 20 minutes of each day reading something substantial, not a blog post, not the news, not whatever's trending, but something with real depth, ideally something that's already stood the test of time. The logic is almost the inverse of how most of us actually start our mornings. Most people reach for their phone first thing, absorbing fragments of other people's urgency before they've had a single original thought of their own. 20 minutes of real reading, McKeown argues, primes the mind for depth before the day's noise has a chance to flood in. He quotes the painter Pablo Picasso on exactly this point, and it's worth sitting with the line directly: without great solitude, no serious work is possible. Not helpful. Not nice to have. Necessary. McKeown's argument throughout this entire chapter is that creative and strategic clarity, the kind that produces a genuinely vital decision rather than a merely good one, simply does not arrive on demand in the middle of a packed schedule. It has to be invited, deliberately, into space you protected on purpose. There's a related trap worth naming here, even though McKeown develops it more fully later in the book, because it grows directly out of everything you've just heard about trade-offs. Once you've made a deliberate choice, once you've decided which problem you want, a new danger appears: the temptation to keep pouring resources into that choice long after the evidence says you should stop, simply because you've already invested so much. The clearest real-world illustration of this McKeown uses isn't a private company or a pseudonymous executive, but rather it's a supersonic passenger jet that actually flew, for real, for decades, the Concorde. Developed jointly by the British and French governments starting in the 1960s, the Concorde was, by any engineering standard, a genuine marvel, a commercial aircraft that could cross the Atlantic in roughly 3 hours, faster than sound itself. But the economics never worked. Fuel costs were enormous. The plane was loud enough that it couldn't fly supersonic over land, which sharply limited its usable routes. Ticket prices had to be set so high that the customer base stayed permanently small. Both governments knew, for years, that the program would never turn a profit. And both governments kept funding it anyway, for years longer than the economics justified, partly because so much had already been spent that stopping felt, psychologically, like admitting the entire investment had been wasted. Economists later coined a specific term for this exact pattern, the Concorde fallacy, precisely because the case was so public, so well documented, and so clean an example of otherwise rational institutions continuing to throw resources at a failing bet simply because they'd already thrown so many resources at it. McKeown's point in raising it here, at the close of this chapter on trade-offs, is this: making a deliberate trade-off once is necessary, but it isn't sufficient. The same discipline that helped you choose has to keep operating after the choice is made, because circumstances change, new information arrives, and the smartest possible move at month 1 is sometimes the wrong move by month 18. An essentialist's commitment is to the goal, not to the sunk cost of getting partway there. He names the psychological mechanism that makes this so hard to act on, the endowment effect, our deeply human tendency to overvalue things simply because we already own them, while undervaluing equivalent things we don't. The fix he proposes is almost embarrassingly simple to state and genuinely difficult to practice: pretend you don't own it yet. If you didn't already have this commitment, this project, and this relationship exactly as it currently stands, how much effort would you spend today to acquire it from scratch? If the honest answer is far less than what you're currently investing, that gap is telling you something important. Let's bring this full episode together now, because discernment and trade-off are really two halves of a single discipline, not two separate skills. Discernment tells you where to look. It's the patient, unglamorous work of creating real space to think, applying genuinely extreme criteria, and developing the judgment to spot the one fact, the one opportunity, the one relationship that actually constitutes the lead of your current chapter, buried among a dozen others that merely look similar on the surface. A trade-off permits you to act on what discernment reveals, even when every option still on the table looks tempting, even when saying no to a good thing feels, in the moment, like a kind of loss. It replaces the comforting fiction of having it all with the more honest, more useful question of which problem, which trade-off, and which version of a constrained life you're actually choosing to live inside. Together, these two disciplines are the difference between a life that's merely full and a life that's genuinely focused. A full life can look impressive from the outside, busy, accomplished, in demand. A focused life is rarer, and it's built one specific way, by deliberately, repeatedly, sometimes uncomfortably choosing less so that the less you keep can actually be better. You have a punch card. You have a closet full of maybes waiting to be thinned down to the handful you actually love. You have a concord of your own somewhere, a project, a commitment, a relationship you're still funding mostly out of momentum rather than genuine belief. Discernment will help you see it clearly. A trade-off will give you the nerve to finally choose. Episode 3, The Perks of Being Unavailable. There's a marketing company in New York, founded by a man named Frank O'Brien, that does something that sounds, on the surface, like a terrible business practice. Once a month, the entire company stops. No phones. No emails. No meetings. A full day, every single month, deliberately empty. O'Brien calls them Do Not Call Mondays, and clients have learned, over time, not to expect a response on those days. It isn't a holiday. It isn't downtime in the casual sense. It's a structured pause, built directly into the company's operating rhythm, for one specific purpose, giving people the actual space to think about what they're doing, rather than just continuing to do it. His underlying logic, stated almost as bluntly as the practice itself, is, if his team is too busy to think, then they're too busy, period. That single idea that thinking time isn't a luxury squeezed in around the edges of real work but is itself a non-negotiable form of real work sits at the center of this episode. The two chapters we're covering, Escape and Look, are really about the same underlying problem from two different angles. How do you create enough distance from the noise of your life to actually see what's essential within it? Let's start with the most extreme, most famous version of deliberate escape that exists in modern business history, Bill Gates and what he calls his Think Week. Twice a year, for more than 2 decades, Gates has isolated himself completely alone, in a cabin near a lake in the Pacific Northwest, cut off from phones, from email, and from nearly all contact with the outside world. The location has reportedly stayed the same for years, a strictly private retreat, sparsely furnished, with meals delivered twice a day by a single staff member so Gates never has to break his concentration to handle anything as mundane as cooking. He brings paper and stacks of reading material, research papers, internal memos, and books, and spends the week doing nothing but reading and thinking, recording his reflections by hand as he goes. This isn't a vacation in any conventional sense. It's structured and disciplined and deliberately uncomfortable in its isolation, closer to a research retreat than a break. And it has, by Gates' own account and by the documented history of Microsoft, produced results that ordinary working weeks inside a busy headquarters never could. The clearest example, in May of 1995, during one of these week-long retreats, Gates wrote an internal memo that would go on to be one of the most consequential documents in the company's history. The Internet tidal wave. At the time, Microsoft had been treating the Internet as something of a fad, a peripheral technology rather than a central one, and the company was visibly behind competitors who'd already begun investing seriously in it. Over the course of that single week of uninterrupted reading and reflection, away from the daily pressure of running a company, Gates concluded the opposite, that the Internet represented an existential shift the company could not afford to ignore, and he laid out, in that memo, the case for redirecting enormous internal resources toward it. The strategic pivot that followed helped produce Internet Explorer, which would go on to dominate the browser market through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. It's worth pausing on what actually happened there, mechanically. Gates didn't generate that insight by working harder, in the conventional sense, inside his normal week. He generated it by removing himself entirely from his normal week by creating a deliberate vacuum where the constant, low-grade noise of running a major company simply couldn't reach him and where a single big, structural question could finally get the kind of sustained, undistracted attention it actually required. McKeown is careful to note that you don't need Bill Gates' resources, or his week of total isolation, to apply the same underlying principle. He points to a place far more accessible than a private lakeside cabin, the D. School at Stanford, formerly known as the Otto-Plattner Institute of Design, where he himself helped develop and teach a course called Designing Life, Essentially. The entire purpose of that class, in McKeown's own words, is to create space for students to design their lives. Each week gives them a scheduled excuse to think. Students are required to turn off their laptops and their phones and, instead, turn on the full power of their own minds. They're given specific assignments designed to practice the deliberate discernment of the essential few from the merely good, the same discernment skill from the previous episode, but now built into a recurring, protected structure rather than left to chance. His point in including this example is direct. You don't need to attend Stanford, and you don't need a cabin in the Pacific Northwest to practice these same habits. What you need is the willingness to treat unstructured thinking time as something that has to be designed into your life on purpose, because it will never simply show up on its own. This is where McKeown's broader argument about escape gets its sharpest edge. In a culture that treats constant availability as a virtue, answer the email fast, show up to every meeting, and respond to every message within minutes, deliberately disappearing for a stretch of time looks, to most people, like negligence. McKeown's claim is the inverse: it's negligence not to. The clarity that produces genuinely essential decisions doesn't arrive in the middle of a frantic schedule. It requires actual distance from that schedule, even if the distance is only 20 minutes or an afternoon, rather than a week. McKeown opens the Look chapter with the same Nora Ephron story you heard in the previous episode, and it's worth understanding why he places it here, too, not just in the discernment chapter. The lesson about finding the lead isn't only about reading, it's about a way of paying attention to your own life that has to be trained, the same way a journalist trains it. He extends that idea with a passage worth hearing close to exactly as he wrote it, because the precision matters. Non-essentialists listen too, he writes, but they listen while preparing to say something. They get distracted by extraneous noise. They hyper-focus on inconsequential details. They hear the loudest voice, but they get the wrong message. In their eagerness to react, they miss the point. He borrows an image from C.S. Lewis to drive the point home. In their rush to respond, non-essentialists end up running around with fire extinguishers during a flood, frantic, well-intentioned, and completely misdirected because they never actually looked closely enough to understand what kind of emergency they were actually in. That's a sharper, more uncomfortable version of listening than most of us are used to applying to ourselves. Most people think of listening as a passive activity. You're either doing it, or you're not. McKeown claims that there's a meaningful difference between hearing sound and actually discerning a signal, and the gap between those two things determines whether you respond to what's actually happening or just to whatever happens to be loudest in the moment. There's a small, almost throwaway detail McKeown includes about his own first encounter with the Stanford D. School that illustrates this principle in a completely different, more physical way. Walking into the room where he'd been asked to teach, the first thing he noticed wasn't anything about the curriculum, it was that there were no traditional chairs. Just foam cubes, low to the ground, distinctly uncomfortable to sit on for any extended period. That wasn't an oversight. Like nearly everything at the D. School, it was deliberate design. After a few minutes of genuine physical discomfort on those cubes, students naturally start shifting, moving, and looking for a different way to sit, and in doing so, they end up paying closer attention to their own bodies and surroundings than they would in an ordinary, comfortable chair that lets the mind drift on autopilot. The discomfort itself becomes a small, structural nudge toward the kind of alert, present attention that genuine looking requires. McKeown's broader argument here is that this same principle, using structure or discomfort to force genuine attention rather than passive autopilot, can be applied deliberately to how you move through your own life. Most of us go through our days on a kind of cruise control, half attending to dozens of things at once, none of them fully. The essentialist's discipline isn't doing more, it's noticing more, with the attention fully present on whatever's actually in front of them at that moment, rather than split between the present task and the next 17 things on the list. This connects directly back to why escape matters so much in the first place. You cannot develop this quality of attention, the kind that lets you actually see the lead buried in the noise of your own life while you're simultaneously trying to process a full inbox, a packed calendar, and a continuous stream of other people's urgent requests. The two skills, escape and look, depend on each other. Escape creates the conditions. Look is the skill you practice once those conditions exist. McKeown makes one more observation in this part of the book that's easy to miss but worth dwelling on, because it cuts against a common assumption about what it means to be focused. You might expect that an essentialist, having committed to doing fewer things, would also explore fewer options before committing. The opposite turns out to be true. Essentialists actually explore more options than non-essentialists do, not fewer. The reasoning is almost the inverse of what intuition suggests. A non-essentialist, eager to please and reluctant to disappoint anyone, tends to commit to nearly everything that's offered to them without taking the time to genuinely explore it first. There simply isn't time because they've already said yes to so much else. An essentialist, by contrast, deliberately holds off on committing, precisely so they have the bandwidth to explore, listen, question, and debate a wide range of possibilities before going all in on the one or two that actually deserve it. The exploration itself isn't the goal is still discernment, still finding the vital few, but you can't discern well from a narrow field you never properly examined in the first place. That's the paradox worth sitting with as this episode moves toward its close. Doing less, in the way McKeown means it, requires looking at more deeply, more patiently, with more genuine attention, before you ever narrow down to the few things you'll actually commit yourself to fully. There's a story McKeown tells near the close of this section of the book, about an executive he calls Jeff, that's worth ending on because it ties escape and look together into a single, lived example rather than two separate ideas. Jeff was, by every external measure, a high achiever, the kind of relentless, always-on executive whose work schedule left no visible gaps. McKeown describes him as someone who had essentially stopped distinguishing between work and the rest of his life. The two had fully merged, and not in a healthy way. He worked through what should have been recovery time, treated rest as something to be earned rather than required, and operated for years as though sheer effort, sustained without interruption, was the only path to continued success. It's worth being honest here. The same way this series has tried to be honest throughout, Jeff isn't independently identified by name elsewhere, and the book doesn't fully specify whether this is a direct case or a composite drawn from McKeown's broader consulting experience. What matters for our purposes is the pattern itself, which shows up consistently enough across multiple of McKeown's documented examples, Sam from earlier episodes and now Jeff, that it's clearly meant to represent something McKeown saw repeatedly in real client work, even where individual privacy required some names to be altered. The lesson McKeown draws from Jeff's situation connects directly to both chapters in this episode. Jeff hadn't built any structural escape into his life. No think week, no do not call Monday, not even an ordinary uninterrupted lunch. And without escape, he'd also lost the capacity for genuine looking, for noticing, with any real clarity, which parts of his relentless effort were actually essential and which parts were simply momentum, habit, and fear of slowing down. This is where the next chapter in the book, which we'll cover fully in the next episode, actually begins, the role of play in restoring exactly this kind of clarity. McKeown makes the case that play isn't a frivolous break from serious work, it's a measurable contributor to the kind of cognitive flexibility that serious work actually depends on. Stress, he points out, activates the brain's emotional centers while simultaneously suppressing the logical, exploratory regions responsible for creative problem solving. In other words, the more relentlessly serious and unbroken your schedule becomes, the worse, not better, your actual thinking gets. Several well-known companies have built this insight directly into their physical environments in ways that look whimsical from the outside but are functioning, deliberately, as creativity infrastructure. Google's offices have featured deliberately playful, almost absurd physical details, a famous example being a life-size dinosaur skeleton on one campus, decorated with pink flamingos, placed there specifically as a visual reminder that imagination has a place in serious work. Twitter and Pixar have invested in improvisation classes and internal hackathons for similar reasons, not as morale perks disconnected from the actual work, but as structured opportunities for the kind of unstructured, low-stakes exploration that often produces breakthroughs ordinary, deadline-driven work cannot. McKeown's broader claim, which the next episode will develop in full, is that play and escape aren't separate from serious productivity, they're prerequisites for it. The same is true of sleep, which the chapter after that addresses directly. not as a weakness to be minimized but as what McKeown calls protecting the asset, treating your own rested, clear-thinking mind as the single most valuable resource you have for making any kind of essential contribution at all. Let's bring escape and look together now, because they really are two movements of a single discipline, the way discern and trade-off were in the previous episode. Escape creates the conditions. It's the discipline of deliberately, repeatedly removing yourself from the noise, whether that's a week at a lakeside cabin, a single protected Monday each month, or 20 minutes of real reading before the day's first notification arrives. Without that removal, clarity simply doesn't have room to form. Look at what you do inside that space once you've created it. It's the trained capacity to listen for a signal instead of noise, to notice the lead buried in a pile of routine facts, and to pay attention with your full mind rather than half of it while the other half drafts a response to something else. Most people never get past the first obstacle, because creating space looks, from the outside, like doing nothing, and our culture has trained nearly all of us to treat visible activity as the only legitimate proof of value. McKeown's entire argument in this part of the book is a direct challenge to that assumption. The visible activity isn't where your best decisions come from. It's where your reactions come from. Your best decisions, the ones that actually determine which problems you spend the next several years living inside, the ones from the previous episode's entire discussion of trade-offs, come from the quiet, protected, often uncomfortable space you have to build on purpose, because the world will never build it for you. You don't need a cabin in the Pacific Northwest. You need one Monday, or one 20-minute morning, or even one foam cube uncomfortable enough to keep you genuinely present. Start there. Episode 4, Protect the Asset. There's a moment early in this part of the book where McKeown stops describing frameworks and just tells you, plainly, what happens to a body that refuses to stop. He opens with the story of an executive he calls Jeff, high-achieving, constantly traveling, operating for years on minimal sleep, treating every hour of rest as time he could theoretically be spending more productively. Jeff pushed past every ordinary warning sign the way ambitious, capable people often do, convincing himself, each time his body protested, that the solution was simply to work harder, push further, and sleep less. Eventually, his body stopped negotiating. His organs began shutting down. His heart rate became erratic. He reached a point where he could barely stand. Even faced with that, even with direct physical evidence that something had gone seriously, dangerously wrong, McKeown notes that Jeff's first instinct was still to convince himself he could push through it. It took being physically forced to stop, rather than choosing to, before he understood what should have been obvious far earlier: rest isn't a reward you earn after the real work is finished. It's a structural requirement for the real work to be possible at all. McKeown places this story at the opening of the play chapter deliberately because it sets up the uncomfortable truth underneath both chapters in this episode. Modern professional culture, almost everywhere, treats play and sleep as the first things to sacrifice when things get busy. Optional, soft, the opposite of serious. McKeown argues that this gets the relationship backwards. Play and sleep aren't the reward you get for doing real work well. They're inputs the real work depends on, and removing them doesn't make you more productive, it makes the entire system, including your judgment, start to fail. Let's start with play, because McKeown's case for it is more counterintuitive than it might first appear. He defines play simply, whatever we do for the sake of doing it, rather than as a means to some other end. Not a hobby pursued for status. Not an exercise pursued for health metrics. Something closer to what children do almost constantly and what most adults have been quietly trained out of, activity undertaken purely because it's enjoyable, with no productivity goal attached. McKeown traces where that training out happens, and it starts earlier than most people realize. Modern schooling, he argues, was built largely on an industrial model designed to produce efficient workers, and play within that model gets treated as something to be tolerated at best, eliminated at worst, as students progress toward serious education. By the time most of us reach the workplace, the message has fully landed: play is what children do, and adulthood means leaving it behind. The research McKeown points to suggests this is a serious mistake, not a harmless cultural quirk. Play, treated seriously rather than dismissed, appears to do three specific things for the brain that have direct relevance to the kind of high-level thinking essential work actually requires. First, play broadens the range of possibilities your mind is willing to consider. When you're not narrowly focused on solving a specific, urgent problem, your brain makes connections it wouldn't otherwise make, unlikely associations, lateral leaps, the kind of unexpected idea that rarely shows up when you're staring directly at a deadline. Second, and this is the mechanism that matters most for understanding why overwork backfires, play functions as a direct antidote to stress. Stress, McKeown explains, activates the brain's emotional centers while actively suppressing the regions responsible for logical reasoning and creative exploration. That's not a metaphor, it's a description of how the stressed brain actually allocates its resources. The more chronically stressed and overworked you become, the less capable your brain literally is of the kind of clear, expansive thinking that essential work demands. Working longer, under more pressure, with less recovery, doesn't just feel worse, it measurably degrades the exact cognitive capacities you're trying to use harder. Third, and somewhat surprisingly, play exercises many of the same mental skills we associate with serious, disciplined work: planning, prioritizing, anticipating what another person or situation might do next, deciding between options, and analyzing outcomes. A game of strategy, an improvisational exercise, or even unstructured tinkering, these activities aren't a break from the skills professional life requires. They're low-stakes practice of those exact skills, in an environment where failure costs nothing and experimentation is encouraged rather than punished. Several companies have taken this seriously enough to build it directly into their physical environments and internal culture, not as a perk disconnected from the work, but as functional infrastructure for the work itself. Google's offices have, at various points, included deliberately playful, almost surreal physical details, a widely noted example being a life-size dinosaur skeleton on one campus, decorated with pink flamingos, placed there specifically as an environmental cue that imagination belongs inside serious work, not outside it. Other companies, including Twitter and Pixar, have invested in formal improvisation classes and internal hackathon event structured time explicitly carved out for play-like exploration, justified not as morale-boosting but as a real driver of the kind of creative problem-solving ordinary, deadline-driven work rarely produces on its own. McKeown offers a specific practice for reconnecting with play that doesn't require a corporate budget or a hackathon, what he calls memory mining. Think back to what you genuinely loved doing as a child, not what you were good at, not what earned praise, but what you did simply because it absorbed you completely. Then ask a direct, practical question: how could you bring some version of that feeling back into your life now, even in a small, adult-scale form? That exercise matters because it cuts through a common misconception about what counts as play. Play doesn't have to be elaborate, expensive, or time-consuming. McKeown points out that something as small as drawing for a few minutes, playing a simple game, or even a deliberately silly office ritual can function as a genuine reset for an overtaxed mind, not because the activity itself is significant, but because it interrupts the stress response long enough for the brain's logical and creative regions to come back fully online. The deeper point, the one that connects back to Jeff's collapse at the start of this chapter, is that play isn't competing with your essential work for limited time. It's part of what makes your essential work possible to sustain it all. Cut it entirely, the way Jeff did, and you don't get more output. Eventually, you get organ failure, an erratic heartbeat, and a body that finally, forcibly, makes the decision you refuse to make yourself. Let's go back to Jeff, because the end of his story matters as much as the beginning. After his body finally forced him to stop, Jeff didn't bounce back in a few weeks. According to McKeown's account, recovering from the damage he'd done to himself took a 2-year sabbatical, 2 years, not 2 weeks, to repair what years of treating sleep as optional had broken. That's worth sitting with directly. The time he saved by sacrificing sleep across his career was, in the end, paid back many times over, all at once, in a form he never chose and couldn't control. McKeown's blunt framing for what's actually at stake here: the best asset you have for making any contribution to the world is yourself, your mind, your body, and your judgment. Underinvest in that asset, and everything downstream of it, every decision, every piece of essential work, every relationship, gets quietly degraded, whether or not you notice the decline happening in real time. The research McKeown draws on to make this case isn't soft or anecdotal. A widely cited Harvard Medical School piece on sleep, titled "Sleep Deficit: The Performance Killer," lays out a comparison that tends to stop people cold the first time they hear it. Significant sleep deprivation produces cognitive impairment roughly comparable to a blood alcohol level of 0.1% past the legal driving limit in most places. You wouldn't hand someone your car keys in that state. Most of us hand ourselves an entire day of consequential decisions in exactly that state, routinely, without a second thought, simply because the impairment doesn't smell like alcohol and nobody's checking. There's a separate study McKeown references, published in the journal Nature, examining puzzle-solving ability before and after sleep. Participants who were given adequate rest between attempts at a problem were significantly more likely to spot a hidden shortcut or insight in the puzzle than those who'd been kept awake. The brain, in other words, doesn't just passively recover during sleep, it appears to actively continue processing problems, occasionally surfacing solutions during rest that conscious, sleep-deprived effort couldn't find. McKeown also connects this to a concept many readers already associate with a completely different book, Malcolm Gladwell's popularization of the 10,000-hour rule for developing expertise. McKeown points out something usually left out of casual retellings of that rule. The original research behind it, studying elite violinists, found that what separated the very best performers wasn't only deliberate practice hours. It was also specifically how much they slept. The top-tier performers in that research averaged significantly more sleep than less accomplished peers, including regular daytime naps, 15. Mastery, in other words, wasn't purely a function of grinding harder. Rest was quietly part of the actual mechanism of becoming excellent, not a break from it. Some companies have built this insight directly into their physical infrastructure, the same way they did with play. Google, again, offers a concrete example: dedicated sleep pods available to employees on certain campuses, with explicit physical permission built into the workplace itself, to treat a short nap as legitimate, productive use of company time rather than something to be hidden or apologized for. McKeown's practical instruction for the reader is direct, and it requires the same mindset shift this entire series has been building toward since the first episode: doing one less thing today, specifically protecting time for sleep, to get more done tomorrow. That's the trade-off, applied to your own body. Sacrificing sleep feels, in the short term, like it buys you more time. McKeown's argument, backed by the research above, is that it's a loan with brutal interest. You get a few extra hours today, and you pay them back, with substantial extra cost, in degraded judgment, slower thinking, and reduced creative capacity tomorrow, and the day after, for as long as the debt goes unpaid. This connects directly into the next chapter in the book, which we'll cover at the start of the next episode: select the discipline of applying genuinely extreme criteria to new opportunities. McKeown reuses, in that chapter, the same Derek Sivers framework you heard about earlier in this series. If it isn't a clear, hell yeah, it's a no. The connection to sleep and play isn't incidental. A mind that's chronically exhausted and play-starved doesn't generate clear, hell yes. It generates foggy maybes, born of depleted judgment rather than genuine enthusiasm, which means protecting your sleep and your capacity for play aren't separate from making good selected decisions. It's the precondition for being able to make them at all. There's one more practice from this part of the book worth covering before we close this episode, because it ties play, sleep, and selection together into something genuinely actionable, what McKeown calls the reverse pilot. Most of us are used to the idea of a pilot program in the conventional sense, testing whether adding something new produces a positive result before fully committing to it. A reverse pilot does the opposite. Instead of testing whether to add an initiative, you test whether removing one causes any actual harm. You quietly stop doing something: a recurring meeting, a report nobody seems to read, a commitment you've kept out of habit rather than clear value, and you simply observe what happens. The results, McKeown notes, are often quietly humbling. A surprising number of things we treat as essential, simply because we've always done them, turn out to be entirely removable the moment someone actually tests the assumption rather than just defending it. Nobody notices. Nothing breaks. The activity had been consuming real time and real energy for the sole reason that no one had bothered to check whether it was still necessary. This connects directly back to everything covered across this episode. Play and sleep aren't separate from the discipline of selection. They're what make genuine selection possible in the first place. A mind running on insufficient rest, starved of any unstructured play, doesn't have the clarity to run a reverse pilot, to notice that a habitual commitment has quietly outlived its usefulness, or to apply real extreme criteria to a new opportunity rather than defaulting to a tired, reflexive yes. Let's bring this full episode together, because play and sleep complete something that started 2 episodes ago, in the discern and trade-off material, and continued through escape and look. Discernment told you where to look for the vital few. The trade-off permitted you to choose between genuinely good options. Escape created the literal space required for that thinking to happen at all. Look, you sharpened your ability to notice the signal once you were inside that space. Play and sleep are different from all 4 of those. They're not about choosing or noticing, they're about maintaining the underlying capacity that makes choosing and noticing possible in the first place. McKeown's central, repeated phrase for this protect the asset is worth holding on to as more than a slogan. Your mind, rested and genuinely at ease, is the actual instrument every other discipline in this series depends on. Discernment performed by an exhausted mind is degraded discernment. A trade-off chosen under chronic stress is a worse trade-off than the same choice made with real clarity. Even your capacity to escape effectively, to create genuine space, depends on having enough underlying reserve left to use that space well rather than simply collapsing into it. Jeff's story, which opened this episode, is the warning case for what happens when this gets ignored entirely. Not a gradual decline you can talk yourself past, but eventually, a body that simply stops cooperating, followed by years spent repairing what could have been protected all along. But there's a more hopeful note to end on, because this episode hasn't only been about a cautionary story. The research is consistent: rest and play aren't the enemy of high performance. They're quietly, measurably, part of its actual mechanism present in the practice routines of elite musicians, built deliberately into the campuses of some of the most demanding companies in the world, and present in the recovery protocols of serious athletes who treat sleep with the same rigor they treat training. The next episode picks up where this one leaves off, moving from explore into eliminate, the part of the book where McKeown shifts from helping you see what's essential to helping you build the actual courage to cut everything else away. That's a different kind of difficulty than anything covered so far. Knowing what matters is one skill. Saying no to everything that doesn't, repeatedly, in real conversations with real people who will sometimes be disappointed in you, that's a separate discipline entirely, and it's where this series goes next. For now, the practical instruction from this episode is simple enough to start tonight: protect the asset. Not as an aspiration. As a decision, it was made the same way every other essential choice in this series gets made, deliberately, on purpose, before the rest of the world decides it for you. Episode 5, The Power of Extreme Criteria. McKeown opens the eliminate section of the book with a small exercise that's almost embarrassing to attempt honestly: try to match a handful of well-known companies to their own official mission statements. It's harder than it should be, and that's entirely the point. Most corporate mission statements are built from the same recycled vocabulary: innovation, leadership, excellence, and customer focus, interchangeable phrases that could plausibly belong to almost any company in almost any industry. They sound serious. They sound considered. And they're nearly useless as actual guides for decision-making, because nothing in them tells you what to do when two reasonable-sounding priorities conflict, which happens constantly in any real organization. McKeown's diagnosis is direct: when people or teams genuinely don't know what they're working toward, they don't simply drift aimlessly, they default to something worse. They start playing politics. They prioritize whatever makes them look productive in the moment rather than whatever actually serves the larger goal, because without real clarity, looking busy becomes a reasonable substitute for being useful. This is where McKeown introduces a concept that's already come up earlier in this series in passing but deserves full attention now, because this entire chapter is built around it: the essential intent. He distinguishes it carefully from three things people often confuse it with. A vision statement can be inspiring, but it's rarely concrete enough to act on. A set of corporate values words like integrity or teamwork tends to be neither inspiring nor concrete, which is why they so often end up ignored, printed on a poster nobody reads. Quarterly objectives are concrete, certainly, but they're rarely inspiring, and they're too short-term to provide real direction beyond the next 90 days. An essential intent sits in a different category entirely. It has to be both inspirational and concrete at once, meaningful and measurable in the same sentence. Done well, McKeown argues, it functions as one decision that settles 1,000 later decisions. It's the kind of single strategic choice that eliminates an entire universe of other options before they ever need to be debated individually. Comparable, he suggests, to deciding early on that you're going to become a doctor rather than a lawyer. That one decision doesn't just point you in a direction, it quietly resolves dozens of smaller decisions for years afterwards, because most choices that don't serve that direction simply stop being live options worth considering. You heard one example of this earlier in the series: Brad Pitt's Make It Right Foundation, with its precise intent to build 150 homes in New Orleans' lower 9th Ward. McKeown offers a second example from outside the world of business or celebrity philanthropy entirely. In 2010, the British government appointed Martha Lane Fox as the UK's first digital champion, tasked broadly with improving the nation's relationship with the internet. A typical mission for a role like that might have stayed vague, something like enhancing digital access or promoting digital literacy, the kind of phrase that sounds responsible but commits to nothing specific. Lane Fox's actual essential intent was sharper: to get everyone in the UK online by the end of 2012. Notice what that sentence does, the same way the Make It Right intent did. Its genuinely inspiring universal internet access is a meaningful, human-scale goal. But it's also brutally measurable. By the end of 2012, you would know, without any ambiguity, whether the effort had succeeded or failed. There was no room to quietly redefine success after the fact. McKeown also tells a story, much smaller in scale but perhaps more personally resonant, about a marine biologist whose name is worth saying plainly because his work is real, ongoing, and independently documented well beyond McKeown's book, Enrique Sala. Sala spent years as a respected university professor, publishing serious, well-cited research on ocean ecosystems and food webs. By his own account, given in multiple interviews over the years, he reached a point where he understood, with painful clarity, exactly what his academic career had become. In his own words, "What I was doing was simply writing the obituary of the ocean. I felt like the doctor who was telling the patient how she was going to die but not offering a solution." That realization didn't lead to a vague resolution to do more for conservation. It led to an essential intent specific enough to act on. In 2008, Sala left his tenured academic position entirely and founded what became National Geographic's Pristine Seas Project, an initiative built around a measurable, public goal of identifying and helping protect the world's last truly pristine ocean ecosystems before they were lost. The project has since gone on to help establish dozens of major marine protected areas, covering millions of square kilometers of ocean, an area larger than entire countries. That outcome, real and ongoing as of this recording, didn't come from a generically inspiring mission to help the ocean. It came from the same mechanism McKeown describes throughout this chapter: a single, sharply defined decision that then resolved an enormous number of smaller decisions about where Sala's time, expertise, and credibility would go for the next decade and beyond. McKeown offers 3 diagnostic questions for anyone trying to find their own version of this kind of clarity, questions meant to be sat with seriously rather than answered glibly. What am I deeply passionate about? What genuinely taps into my particular talent? And what meets a significant, real need in the world? The essential intent worth building a career or a season of life around tends to live at the overlap of those 3 answers, not any one of them alone, but the narrow, demanding intersection of all 3 together. This is harder than it sounds, and McKeown is honest about that difficulty. Developing a genuine essential intent requires real courage, because it means deliberately closing off other paths that might also have been perfectly reasonable. It requires real vision, because you're committing to a direction before you can fully see where it leads. And it requires constant maintenance, because the world will continue offering you other reasonable-sounding opportunities that have nothing to do with the intent you've chosen, and each one will require you to say no again, even when saying yes would have been easy and would have cost you nothing in the short term. This is the closing piece of the Clarify discussion, and it leads directly into something McKeown spends an entire chapter on, because identifying your essential intent is only half the work. The other half is saying no to everything that doesn't serve it, repeatedly, in real conversations, with real people who will sometimes be disappointed in you. That's a fundamentally different kind of difficulty than identifying priorities in the abstract, and McKeown treats it as its own discipline, worth examining carefully. He starts by naming why this is so hard, and his explanation reaches back further than office politics or modern social pressure. For most of human history, belonging to your group wasn't optional, it was the difference between survival and death. If the tribe rejected you, you didn't simply lose some social standing, you lost access to food, protection, and the basic infrastructure of staying alive. Saying no to the group, disappointing the people you depended on, carried genuinely existential stakes. That survival pressure shaped something deep in how humans are wired to respond to social risk. McKeown's point is that the wiring hasn't caught up with reality. Saying no to a colleague's request today carries essentially none of the danger it would have carried tens of thousands of years ago. Nobody's survival is actually at stake when you decline a meeting invitation, but the discomfort your nervous system generates in that moment can feel disproportionately, irrationally large, because it's running on hardware built for a much higher stakes world. There's a second, more straightforward reason saying no is hard, and McKeown is blunt about naming it. A lot of us simply aren't clear enough about what's essential in the first place. If you don't have a genuine, specific essential intent, the thing this entire episode has been building toward, you have no real defense available when a request arrives. Everything looks equally plausible as something you should do, because you haven't done the work of deciding, in advance, what actually qualifies. Clarity isn't just useful for its own sake. It's the only thing that makes a confident no possible, because you need to know what you're protecting before you can defend it. McKeown offers a reframe here that's worth sitting with directly, because it cuts against an assumption most of us carry without examining it. When someone requests something of you, we tend to fuse the request itself with our relationship to the person making it. Saying no to the favor starts to feel, emotionally, indistinguishable from rejecting the person. McKeown's corrective: those two things are not the same. Denying a specific request is not the same as denying the relationship behind it. Only once you genuinely separate the decision from the relationship can you make a clear, honest choice about the request itself, and then communicate that choice with real compassion toward the person, rather than either caving to avoid discomfort or being needlessly harsh in an attempt to seem firm. He also names a structural unfairness in how most workplaces and social environments actually function, almost as a kind of confession. In many cultures, we are systematically punished for good behavior, for saying no, and for holding a boundary, and rewarded for what is, in the long run, often the worst behavior: saying yes automatically, without real thought, simply to avoid the brief discomfort of disappointing someone. That automatic yes produces a quick hit of social approval in the moment. But McKeown's observation, drawn from years of watching this pattern play out, is that the relief is short-lived. After the rush of having pleased someone fades, what's left is often a quiet resentment at the person who asked, and just as often at yourself, for caving when you knew, somewhere underneath the immediate social pressure, that you shouldn't have. So what does saying no gracefully actually look like in practice, rather than as an abstract principle? McKeown offers a set of specific, low-drama techniques, and they're worth walking through individually, because each handles a slightly different kind of situation. The first is what he calls the awkward pause. When a request arrives, you simply don't answer immediately. You let a few seconds of genuine silence sit there before responding. Not performed, not dramatic, just real space, often as little as a slow count to 3, 17. That tiny pause does something surprisingly powerful. It interrupts the automatic, reflexive yes that most of us default to under social pressure, and it signals to the other person, without a single word, that this request is actually being considered rather than rubber-stamped. The second is the soft no, sometimes phrased as no, but. You decline the specific request while still offering something, an alternative, a future possibility, or an acknowledgement of the relationship itself. Something like, I'm fully consumed with a particular project right now, but I'd genuinely love to help once that's finished. 18. It isn't evasive. It's honest about your current capacity while leaving the door open rather than slamming it. A third option, simple but underused: let me check my calendar and get back to you. This buys you real time to think clearly, away from the immediate social pressure of the person's expectant face or the urgency in their message, and it almost always produces a more honest answer than whatever you would have blurted out under pressure. A fourth approach reframes the conversation entirely by putting the trade-off back onto the person making the request, asking directly, what should I deprioritize to take this on? This works particularly well with a boss or senior colleague because it forces them to confront, out loud, that your time is genuinely finite, that adding this new thing means something else has to give, and they need to be the one to decide what that something is. What ties all of these techniques together is the principle McKeown returns to throughout this entire chapter: the goal was never to say no to everything. The goal is to say no, frequently, and without excessive apology, to everything that isn't truly essential, specifically so that you have the genuine capacity, energy, and attention left to say yes, fully and without resentment, to the rare things that actually matter. McKeown opens the Dare chapter with a quote from Ernest Hemingway that, on first hearing, sounds almost contradictory: courage is grace under pressure. 21. The pairing of those two words, courage and grace, is deliberate. McKeown isn't arguing that an essentialist needs to be harsh or combative to protect their priorities. He's arguing the opposite, that real courage, applied to the act of saying no, looks far more like composure than confrontation. He returns one more time to Rosa Parks, the same example you heard in an earlier episode, but places her here, in this chapter specifically, because the point being made is sharper and more particular than it was the first time. McKeown is explicit that Parks wasn't naturally outspoken or rebellious by temperament. By her own account, she'd been hesitant even to accept the comparatively low-stakes role of secretary for her local NAACP chapter. The courage she displayed on that Montgomery bus wasn't a personality trait she'd always had. It was a specific, hard-won clarity about what she was no longer willing to accept, arrived at in a single moment, and acted on despite genuine, justified fear of the consequences. McKeown's phrase for this, repeated by multiple readers independently because it's evidently one of the book's more quoted lines, "The right no, spoken at the right time, can change the course of history." He's careful not to claim that every personal no carries that kind of historical weight. Obviously, almost none do. But the underlying mechanism is the same regardless of scale. A clear, well-timed refusal, grounded in real clarity about what matters, has consequences that ripple forward in ways a vague, conflict-avoidant yes never does. There's a smaller, more contemporary example McKeown includes that illustrates the same principle inside an ordinary, modern business relationship, one involving two figures most people will recognize by name. When Steve Jobs hired the graphic designer Paul Rand in 1986 to create the visual identity for his new company, Next, Jobs made what seemed like an entirely reasonable request. He asked Rand to come up with a few different design options to choose between. Rand refused, flatly and immediately. In Jobs' own later recollection of the exchange, given in a recorded interview years afterwards, he asked Rand if he'd come up with a few options, and Rand told him, "No, I will solve your problem for you, and you will pay me. You don't have to use the solution. If you want options, go talk to other people." It's worth sitting with how unusual that response was, especially given the power dynamic in the room. Jobs was the client, paying a substantial fee, reportedly around $100,000 for a single design, delivered with no alternatives and no revisions offered. Rand, in his early 70s at the time and already a legendary figure in graphic design, simply declined to operate the way most designers operate with demanding clients. He delivered exactly one solution, presented with a 100-page document explaining the reasoning behind every choice, and left Jobs to either accept it or walk away entirely. Jobs accepted it. And by his own account, given well after the fact, the experience didn't damage the relationship. It deepened his respect for Rand specifically because of that refusal, not despite it. McKeown's point in using an example like this is the same one underlying the entire chapter: a clear, confident no, grounded in genuine expertise and real clarity about what you're willing to do, frequently earns more respect than an accommodating yes ever could. The accommodating designer who delivers 5 mediocre options to avoid conflict rarely produces the kind of work, or the kind of professional standing, that a single confident refusal sometimes does. McKeown is careful to note that trading popularity for respect is a real trade, not a free upgrade. There's often a genuine short-term cost. Some people will be mildly put off by a clear no, at least initially. But he distinguishes sharply between popularity, which is fleeting and depends on never disappointing anyone, and respect, which tends to compound over time precisely because it signals that your word means something, that when you do say yes, it's because the thing actually earned it, not because you lack the nerve to decline. Let's close this episode by bringing select, clarify, and dare together, because they form a continuous chain of discipline, each one depending on the one before it. Select is the filtering skill, applying genuinely extreme criteria so that only the rare, unambiguous opportunities get through in the first place. Clarify takes that filtering and points it at the largest scale, not individual decisions, but the single essential intent that quietly resolves 1,000 smaller decisions before they ever need to be debated. And there is the courage required to actually act on both of those, out loud, in real conversations, even when the person on the other end of the request would prefer to hear yes. None of these 3 chapters works in isolation. Clarity without the courage to say no is just an unused map, the same conclusion this series reached back in its very first episode. And courage without genuine clarity about what you're protecting is just stubbornness, refusal for its own sake, disconnected from any real essential intent worth defending. The next episode moves further into the eliminate section of the book, Uncommit and Edit, covering what happens after you've said yes to something that, in hindsight, never deserved it, and how to walk that back without pretending the mistake never happened. That's a different kind of courage than saying no in the first place. It's the courage to admit, openly, that a decision you already made and already invested in was the wrong one, and to cut your losses anyway, rather than continuing to defend a choice simply because reversing it feels, in the moment, like admitting failure. Episode 6, The Power of a Graceful No. There's a real, well-documented story McKeown opens the Uncommit chapter with, and it's worth telling in full because it's almost a parable, except every detail of it actually happened. An American named Henry Gribome stopped at a carnival game during a trip to a Florida fair, the kind of stand where you toss a ball, ring a bell, and win a prize. He didn't win on his first try. So he tried again. And again. Each attempt cost a small amount, individually trivial, the kind of expense nobody would think twice about. But Gribome kept going, convinced that one more try would finally produce the win that would make all the previous tries worth it. By the time he stopped, Henry Gribome had spent his entire life savings, reportedly around $20,000, at that single carnival booth. What he walked away with was a stuffed banana with dreadlocks. McKeown doesn't tell this story because it's funny, although it is. He tells it because the psychological mechanism behind Gribome's decision to keep playing isn't actually unusual or irrational in the way it first appears. It's a vivid, extreme version of something every single person listening to this has done in some smaller form. Economists call it sunk cost bias, the tendency to keep investing time, money, or energy into something specifically because you've already invested so much, even once it's become clear the investment isn't paying off and likely never will. The trap compounds itself the longer it runs. The more you've already put in, the more determined you become to see it through to some kind of payoff, which means the next dollar, the next hour, the next round of effort always feels justified by everything that came before it, even when, viewed from outside the situation entirely, continuing is obviously the worst choice. It explains why people sit through a genuinely terrible movie because they already paid for the ticket. It explains why a home renovation drags on for years past any reasonable budget, because abandoning it now would mean admitting everything already spent was wasted. It explains why people stay in unhealthy relationships, in failing business ventures, and in projects at work that everyone privately knows aren't working, simply because walking away now would make the previous investment feel like a total loss rather than a partial one. McKeown points to a far larger, government-scale version of the same bias to show it isn't just an individual failing, it's a pattern serious institutions fall into as well. The Concorde, the supersonic passenger jet developed jointly by the British and French governments starting in the 1960s, could cross the Atlantic in roughly 3 hours. It was also, almost from the beginning, a financial catastrophe. Fuel costs were enormous. Noise restrictions meant it couldn't fly supersonic over land, severely limiting its usable routes. Both governments understood, for years, that the program would never be profitable. And both kept funding it anyway, for years longer than the economics justified, in large part because so much had already been spent that stopping felt, psychologically, like admitting the entire program had been a mistake. Economists later named the pattern directly after the case the Concorde fallacy because it was public, well documented, and clean enough to become the textbook example. McKeown identifies sunk cost bias as the first of several specific, commitment traps, that keep people locked into non-essential activities long past the point where letting go would clearly be the better choice. There are at least 3 more worth naming individually, because each one works through a slightly different psychological mechanism, and recognizing which one is operating in your own situation makes it easier to actually act against it. The first is the endowment effect, which you've heard referenced earlier in this series but deserves direct attention now. It's the tendency to overvalue something simply because you already own it, while undervaluing an equivalent thing you don't own. This shows up with physical possessions. Any collector will tell you their items are worth more than the actual market says, but it shows up just as powerfully with commitments and activities. The project or committee you can't bring yourself to step away from, not because it's still genuinely valuable, but because some part of you has started to believe you're personally indispensable to it, simply because you've been involved in it for so long. McKeown's antidote for this particular trap is a single reframing question, and it's worth holding on to directly. Instead of asking how much you value what you already have, ask how much you would actually pay to acquire it if you didn't have it yet. Instead of asking how sad you'd feel to lose an opportunity, ask what you'd actually be willing to do, right now, to go get it from scratch. The gap between those two answers, what you're currently protecting versus what you'd actually choose if starting fresh, is usually where the truth about a commitment's real value is hiding. The second additional trap is something McKeown calls, simply, the fear of waste, the deep discomfort that comes with the idea of abandoning something you've already invested real resources into, even when continuing the investment is clearly the worst option. McKeown's pushback here is direct. The resources are already spent, whether you continue or not. Treating future time and energy as somehow obligated to a past decision doesn't recover what's already gone, it just adds new losses on top of the old ones. The only way out, he argues, is being willing to admit failure quickly, because only once you've genuinely admitted a mistake can you actually stop compounding it. McKeown tells a brief, personal version of this struggle from his own life, a project he'd committed real time and reputation to and couldn't bring himself to walk away from, even once it had clearly stopped working. He kept telling himself, I can make it work, the way most of us do when we're too close to a sunk cost decision to see it clearly. What finally broke the pattern wasn't a clever framework or a spreadsheet. It was a single sentence from a friend he'd confided in, who listened to the whole situation and then said simply, "You're not married to this." That sentence, McKeown writes, gave him the emotional permission he hadn't been able to give himself, the reminder that a commitment, however long-standing, isn't an identity. It's a choice, and choices can be unmade. The third trap is the status quo bias, the simple, deeply human habit of continuing to do something for no better reason than that it's what's always been done. Anyone who's worked inside a company with an outdated process that nobody questions has watched this play out directly. The system was built for a different set of circumstances. Those circumstances have long since changed, and yet the system persists, not because anyone's actively defending it, but because actively dismantling it requires a deliberate decision that nobody's bothered to make. McKeown's proposed countermeasure for status quo bias is a practice borrowed directly from corporate finance: zero-based budgeting. In ordinary budgeting, each year's spending plan starts from last year's numbers, with adjustments made at the margins. Zero-based budgeting throws that baseline away entirely. Every single expense has to be justified from scratch, as though it were being proposed for the very first time, with no inherited assumption that it deserves to continue simply because it existed last year. Applied to a budget, this does several specific things. It allocates resources based on actual current need rather than inherited history, it surfaces budgets that have quietly become bloated over time, and it forces genuine clarity about why each expense actually serves the organization's real priorities, rather than simply assuming it does because it always has. The same logic, McKeown argues, applies directly to your own life, not just to a corporate spreadsheet. If you were building your calendar, your commitments, and your relationships completely from scratch today, with zero inherited assumptions, which of your current obligations would you actually choose to take on again? Anything that wouldn't survive that test is very likely something you're maintaining purely out of status quo bias, not genuine present tense value. There are two more techniques McKeown offers for breaking free of a commitment trap once you've recognized it, and both are worth covering directly before this episode moves into its second chapter. The first is a small but pointed cultural reference McKeown uses to make an uncomfortable pattern visible. He warns against what he calls trying to force a fit, clinging to a role, a relationship, or a project that was never actually right for you simply because you've already invested so much energy trying to make it work. He illustrates it with the 1982 film Tootsie, in which Dustin Hoffman's character spends most of the story trying, increasingly desperately, to be something he fundamentally isn't. McKeown's point isn't really about the movie, it's that all of us are tempted, at some point, to keep forcing ourselves into a commitment that was simply a mismatch from the start, professionally or personally, rather than admitting the fit was wrong and adjusting course. The second technique is more practical and easier to apply directly: get a neutral second opinion. McKeown's observation here is straightforward but easy to forget. In the moment the person most invested in a decision is, almost by definition, the worst positioned person to evaluate it objectively, precisely because they're the one carrying all the sunk cost and ego attached to having made the original choice. A friend, a colleague, or an advisor with no stake in the outcome can often see, within minutes, what's been invisible to you for months, simply because they're not the one who has to admit they were wrong if the project gets cut. McKeown closes the Uncommit chapter by widening the lens slightly, connecting it back to a theme from earlier in this series. He warns against making casual commitments in the first place. The small, seemingly low stakes, "sure, I'll do that" responses that, multiplied across a year, quietly accumulate into the very commitment traps this entire chapter has been about escaping. His suggested fix echoes a technique from an earlier episode: pause before you speak. A few seconds of genuine consideration before agreeing to anything, however minor it seems in the moment, prevents an enormous amount of future sunk cost entanglement, because it's far easier to never make a bad commitment than to extract yourself from one later. Let's move now into the second half of this episode, the edit chapter, because it picks up exactly where Uncommit leaves off, but applies the same underlying discipline somewhere most of us have never thought to apply it: the actual narrative shape of our own lives. McKeown opens this chapter by turning to a profession built entirely around a single, specific skill: knowing what to cut. Film editors don't add footage to make a movie better. They remove it deliberately and ruthlessly, scene by scene, until what remains is the leanest possible version of the story that still carries its full emotional weight. The book's own title for this chapter, drawn directly from the field, calls editing the invisible art, and that phrase comes from how working editors actually describe their own craft. Walter Murch, the Academy Award-winning editor behind films including Apocalypse Now and The English Patient, has written and spoken extensively about exactly this principle. Editing, done well, should be unnoticeable. The audience should never consciously register a cut. They should simply feel pulled forward through the story, unaware that someone made hundreds of small, deliberate decisions about exactly what to leave out. Murch has described his own approach to deciding what to cut using what he calls the Rule of 6, a hierarchy of considerations he weighs for every single cut, with emotion sitting at the very top. The technical concerns that occupy most amateur editors, keeping continuity perfectly smooth and matching the geometry of a scene exactly, Murch ranks as the least important criterion, almost an afterthought compared to a more basic question: does this cut serve what the audience is supposed to feel in this moment? If a technically perfect cut serves the emotion poorly, Murch will choose the technically imperfect cut that serves the emotion well every time. McKeown's application of this to your own life is direct and worth holding on to as a genuinely practical tool, not just a metaphor. Most of us never edit our own lives the way a professional editor approaches raw footage. We simply accumulate more commitments, more relationships, more obligations, and more stuff without ever stepping back to ask the editor's actual question: does this scene, this commitment, this relationship serve the larger story I'm actually trying to tell with my life, or is it just footage that got left in because removing it felt harder than keeping it? The skill isn't really about subtraction for its own sake. It's about subtraction in service of a clearer, more emotionally coherent story. The same essential intent from earlier in this series, now applied not to a single decision, but to the entire shape and rhythm of how you spend your days, your relationships, and your years. McKeown lays out 4 specific principles drawn directly from professional editing, and each one translates into something genuinely usable in your own life, not just a tidy metaphor. The first is simply cut. Removing options is, in McKeown's framing, the very essence of decision-making, and there's a linguistic detail he points to that makes the point almost physically vivid. The word decision comes from Latin roots meaning to cut or to kill. A real decision was never meant to be a gentle, additive process. It was understood, etymologically, as an act of deliberate severing. Choosing one path necessarily means killing off the others, and pretending otherwise, trying to keep every option alive indefinitely, isn't actually deciding at all. It's deferring. The second principle is condense, not doing more at once, but doing the same thing with less waste. McKeown applies this first to language itself. Can you say in one sentence what you've been saying in 2? Can you replace 2 words with 1 without losing the meaning? Condensing isn't about being curt or withholding information. It's about lowering the ratio of effort to actual result, saying precisely what needs to be said, no more, so that what you do communicate lands with its full weight instead of getting diluted across unnecessary length. He illustrates this principle with a real, concrete case far removed from language. Graham Hill, an entrepreneur who, after years of building and ultimately selling several companies, made a deliberate, public experiment of paring his life down to a 420 square foot apartment in New York City. The project, which Hill documented and turned into a venture called Life Edited, wasn't built around deprivation for its own sake. It was a working demonstration of the same condensing principle applied to physical space. Every square foot had to justify itself. Furniture had to serve multiple functions. The constraint of less space didn't make the apartment feel diminished. By most accounts of the project, it made the space feel sharper, more intentional, with nothing present that wasn't actually earning its place. The third principle is correct. McKeown's term for the ongoing, never-finished discipline of regularly comparing your current activities and behavior against your actual essential intent and making adjustments whenever they've quietly drifted apart. He compares this to the work of a magazine or website editor, who isn't done editing once a piece is published. They're continually correcting grammar, tone, and clarity across every subsequent issue, treating editing not as a single event but as a permanent, ongoing posture. The same applies to your own priorities. You don't identify your essential intent once and then coast on that clarity forever. You return to it regularly, checking whether your actual behavior over the past month still matches what you claimed mattered most and correcting course the moment it doesn't. The fourth and final principle is the one most people overlook entirely, because it sounds, on first hearing, like the opposite of editing: edit less. McKeown is careful to clarify what he means, because this isn't permission to abandon discipline, it's a warning against a different kind of failure, one where editing itself becomes another form of restless, undisciplined activity. An overzealous editor who can't stop tinkering, who keeps cutting and adjusting and second-guessing indefinitely, eventually undermines the very clarity editing was supposed to produce. Sometimes the most essentialist choice is restraint, leaving something alone once it's genuinely working, rather than treating constant intervention as proof of diligence. McKeown offers an image to tie all 4 principles together that's worth carrying with you past this episode. Think of your life as an overgrown garden. You have a limited amount of time, energy, money, and attention to cultivate it. You can try to tend every single plant in that garden equally, and the inevitable result is that the few plants that actually matter most to you never get the focused care they need to truly thrive, because your attention is spread too thin across everything else growing alongside them. Or you can do the harder, more deliberate work of pulling the weeds, cutting out what's non-essential, even when individual weeds look harmless on their own, so that the plants you actually care about finally have the room, the light, and the resources to grow the way they were always capable of growing. Let's bring this full episode together now, because uncommit and edit really are 2 stages of a single, continuous discipline. Uncommit is the harder, more emotionally loaded half, recognizing that a past decision, however much you've already invested in it, is no longer serving you, and finding the genuine courage to admit that honestly rather than continuing to defend the sunk cost. It requires confronting your own endowment effect, your own fear of waste, your own quiet attachment to the status quo simply because it's familiar. Edit is the steadier, more sustainable practice that follows. Once you've genuinely uncommitted from what doesn't belong, editing is the ongoing discipline of keeping your life lean, cutting deliberately, condensing without losing meaning, correcting course regularly, and knowing, just as importantly, when to leave well enough alone. Together, they answer a question this entire series keeps circling back to in slightly different forms. Not what should I add to make my life better, but what could I remove that would make everything I keep, finally, actually thrive. The next episode moves into the final chapter of the Eliminate section limit, on the freedom of setting real boundaries before this series turns, in its second half, toward Execute, the discipline of actually carrying out the essential few things you've spent 5 episodes learning how to identify and protect. Episode 7, The Invisible Art. McKeown opens this chapter with an image worth picturing directly. Imagine a schoolyard sitting beside a busy street. If there's no fence, the teachers have to spend their entire recess in a state of low-grade vigilance, constantly watching, constantly correcting, and constantly pulling children back from the edge of the property, because the boundary of safe space exists only in the teachers' heads, not in the world itself. Now imagine a fence installed along that same boundary. The children can now run freely, right up to the edge of where the fence stands, without a teacher needing to track every single movement. The fence doesn't restrict the children's freedom. Paradoxically, it expands it, because now they can play with full abandon within a clearly marked space, rather than being constantly, anxiously called back from an invisible line only the adults can see. That's McKeown's central reframe for this entire chapter, and it's worth holding on to precisely. A non-essentialist tends to experience boundaries as constraints, limitations imposed from outside, restricting what they're allowed to do. An essentialist experiences boundaries the opposite way, as a source of freedom. Clear boundaries protect your time from being silently hijacked by other people's priorities, and they remove the exhausting burden of having to negotiate, in the moment, every single time someone makes a request that falls outside what you've already decided matters. Without the fence, you're the teacher pacing the entire yard, exhausted, watching everything at once. With it, you can actually focus. He tells a story, and it's worth being precise about how he frames it, because it's presented as an illustrative case from his broader work rather than a named, identified individual, involving a married couple who came to a psychologist deeply frustrated that their adult son simply wouldn't take responsibility for his own life. They described, at length, how much of their own time, money, and energy they poured into managing his problems for him, covering his expenses, untangling his messes, and worrying constantly on his behalf. The psychologist's response cut straight through the framing they'd brought into the room. Your son doesn't actually have a problem. You do. You're the one paying. You're the one worrying. You're the one planning around his choices and exerting all the energy. He doesn't feel any real need to change, because the two of you have already taken the problem entirely off his hands. McKeown's lesson from that exchange applies far beyond parenting an adult child. When you take on a problem that genuinely isn't yours to solve, out of love, out of guilt, out of a reflexive instinct to be helpful, you're not actually helping the other person. You're robbing them of the only thing that might eventually produce real change, the natural consequence of having to solve their own problem themselves. This is, in McKeown's framing, one of the clearest places where boundaries function as something other than selfishness. A boundary that refuses to absorb someone else's problem isn't withholding care. It's often the only form of care that actually respects the other person's capacity to handle their own life. He extends this same logic into a workplace example that many listeners will recognize immediately, even if the specific details differ from their own experience. A team member who consistently misses deadlines and who hands in work that's incomplete or rushed gets bailed out repeatedly, quietly by a manager or colleague who stays late to fix the gaps rather than letting the consequences of the missed deadline actually land where they belong. Each rescue feels, in the moment, like reasonable kindness. Across months or years, McKeown's framework would describe it differently. It's a boundary that was never set, and its absence has trained the underperforming team member that there's no real cost to underperforming because someone else will always quietly absorb the impact. So how, practically, do you actually build these fences, rather than just recognizing, after the fact, that you should have? McKeown offers several concrete techniques. The first is identifying your deal breakers in advance. Specific categories of request or behavior that you've decided, ahead of time, will simply receive an automatic no, regardless of how the individual request is phrased or how compelling the person asking makes it sound in the moment. The value of deciding this in advance, rather than case by case, is enormous. In the moment, decisions are vulnerable to social pressure, to flattery, and to the discomfort of disappointing someone directly in front of you. A deal breaker decided calmly, in advance, with no specific person's face attached to it yet, is far more durable than a boundary you're trying to construct on the spot while someone is actively asking you to cross it. The second is what McKeown calls crafting social contracts, explicit, often surprisingly simple conversations held before a relationship or working arrangement begins that lay out expectations clearly enough that ambiguity doesn't have room to creep in later. Rather than discovering, mid-conflict, that you and a colleague had wildly different assumptions about response times, availability, or scope, an essentialist tries to have that conversation early, while goodwill is high and stakes are low, rather than after a violation has already happened and emotions are already running hot. There's a phrase McKeown borrows that closes out this part of the chapter cleanly, attributed to the writer and Lamott: no is a complete sentence. You don't need to justify a boundary with an elaborate explanation every time you hold it. The explanation, repeated endlessly, often does more to erode the boundary than to strengthen it. Every justification becomes another opening for negotiation. A clean, calmly stated no, especially one rooted in a deal breaker you'd already decided on in advance, doesn't require a defense. It simply requires you to actually say it and mean it, the way the fence in McKeown's opening image doesn't need to explain itself to every child who runs up against it. It's just there, consistently, doing its job. This brings us to the close of the Eliminate section and into the opening of the fourth and final part of the book, Execute, the discipline of actually carrying out the essential few things you've spent 6 episodes learning how to identify and protect. McKeown opens this new chapter with a quote attributed to Abraham Lincoln, one that frames the entire idea of preparation in a single memorable image: give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. The work itself, the actual swinging, the actual cutting, takes up only a third of the total time. The rest is preparation, invisible to anyone watching, except the final result, but entirely responsible for how efficiently that final result gets achieved. McKeown calls this a discipline buffer, and he illustrates it with one of the oldest preparation stories in recorded literature, the account of Joseph in the Hebrew Bible. Pharaoh has a disturbing recurring dream: 7 healthy, well-fed cows emerging from the Nile, followed by 7 gaunt, starving cows that proceed to devour the healthy ones. None of Pharaoh's advisors can make sense of it. Joseph, brought in as an outsider with a reputation for interpreting dreams, offers a reading that turns out to be exactly right. Egypt is about to experience 7 years of extraordinary abundance, immediately followed by 7 years of devastating famine. What makes the story relevant to this chapter isn't the prophecy itself, it's what Joseph recommends doing about it. Rather than simply warning Pharaoh and leaving the response to chance, Joseph proposes a specific, structural buffer. During each of the 7 abundant years, store roughly 20% of the grain harvest, building up a substantial reserve before the famine ever arrives. 9. By the time the lean years actually hit, Egypt had years of stored surplus sitting in reserve, not just enough to survive the famine domestically, but enough, according to the account, to sustain neighboring regions and even Joseph's own extended family, who arrive seeking food once their own land stores have run out. The discipline Joseph demonstrates is one McKeown returns to throughout this chapter: use the good times to prepare for the bad times, rather than consuming every available resource the moment it arrives simply because the present moment happens to feel abundant. A non-essentialist, receiving an unexpected windfall, extra time, extra money, an unusually easy week, tends to consume it immediately, treating the surplus as something to be spent rather than banked. An essentialist treats the same windfall as an opportunity to build reserve capacity for whatever inevitably, eventually, goes wrong. McKeown points to a real, contemporary, fully verifiable example of this exact principle operating at a national scale: Norway's sovereign wealth fund. Rather than spending the full proceeds of its oil revenue as it arrived, the Norwegian government chose to invest a substantial portion of that windfall into a long-term national endowment built specifically as a buffer against the day oil revenue eventually declines, or global energy markets shift. That fund has since grown into one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world, a national-scale demonstration of exactly the principle Joseph applied to Egypt's grain reserves 3,000 years earlier: don't consume abundance the moment it appears. Bank it, deliberately, against the future you can't yet see clearly but can reasonably expect will eventually arrive. There's a similar, more individual-scale example involving Warren Buffett, a figure who has appeared several times across this series already. Buffett has long been known for maintaining a substantial cash reserve within his investment company, even during periods when markets are performing extremely well, and most other investors are fully deployed, chasing maximum returns. That discipline of keeping cash in reserve, rather than maximizing exposure during good times, has repeatedly given him the unusual freedom to invest decisively during market panics, buying when others are forced to sell, precisely because he wasn't fully exposed when the downturn arrived. McKeown's term for this advantage, used directly in the chapter's own title, is the unfair advantage. Unfair not because it involves any rule-breaking, but because almost nobody else has the discipline to build the buffer in the first place, which means almost nobody else is positioned to act when the moment that buffer was built for finally arrives. McKeown translates this principle into a specific, immediately usable habit for ordinary daily planning: the planning fallacy. Decades of behavioral research confirm something most people already suspect about themselves but rarely correct, for we are, almost universally, overly optimistic about how long a task will actually take, how smoothly a project will actually go, and how few obstacles we'll actually encounter along the way. McKeown's blunt fix: whatever your honest estimate for how long something will take, add 50% to it. Not because you're bad at planning specifically, but because essentially everyone underestimates in the same direction, for the same predictable psychological reasons, and building in that margin ahead of time prevents the cascading stress of constantly running behind a schedule that was unrealistic from the moment it was written. The planning fallacy itself has a specific origin worth knowing because it grounds McKeown's add 50% rule in real, peer-reviewed research rather than just intuition. The term was coined by the psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in 1979, describing a remarkably consistent finding: people underestimate how long a task will take, even when they've done that exact task multiple times before and have direct personal evidence of how long it actually requires. The research since then has only made the finding more robust, not less. One study tracking psychology students writing their senior thesis found that only 30% of them finished within the time frame they themselves had predicted, and these were students who, by definition, had written research papers before and had real prior experience to draw on. Large public infrastructure projects show the same pattern at a vastly larger scale. London's Wembley Stadium was originally scheduled for completion in 2003, construction didn't even begin until September 2002. Boston's Big Dig highway project ran roughly $19 billion over its original budget and finished nearly a decade behind schedule. These aren't unusual failures of competence, they're the predictable, well-documented signature of a bias that affects individuals and massive professional engineering teams in the same way. There's a particularly revealing detail buried in this research that McKeown highlights directly because it suggests the planning fallacy isn't purely a failure of estimation, it's partly social. One study found that when people were asked to estimate, anonymously, how long a task would actually take, the planning fallacy largely disappeared. Their anonymous estimates were notably more accurate than the estimates they gave when their name and reputation were attached to the prediction. The implication is uncomfortable but clarifying: often, we already know, somewhere underneath the optimistic timeline we announce out loud, that the task will take longer than we're claiming. We just don't want to be the person in the room admitting it, so we offer the timeline we think people want to hear rather than the one we privately suspect is true. McKeown's 50% buffer rule is, in this light, less a productivity trick and more a structural workaround for that social pressure, building the honest margin into your plan from the very beginning, rather than relying on willpower to admit, in the moment, that your optimistic public estimate was never realistic to begin with. He offers 5 specific questions worth asking when you're trying to build a genuine buffer into any important project, whether at work or at home. What's the worst that could realistically happen if this doesn't go as planned? What unexpected obstacles have come up on similar projects before, and is there any reason to think this one will be different? What is the very first action you need to take if things did go wrong, and have you actually prepared for that contingency or just assumed you'd figure it out under pressure? Where, specifically, are you most likely to be caught off guard? And finally, the question that ties this entire chapter back to the central discipline of the whole book: what could you remove from your plan right now, in advance, to reduce the number of places where something could realistically go wrong? That last question is a deliberate bridge into the next chapter the book covers, which we'll pick up at the start of the following episode: Subtract, built around a different default response to obstacles than most people instinctively reach for. McKeown notes that when most of us think about executing a difficult project, our default instinct is addition: throw more time at it, more resources, more effort, and more people. Essentialists, consistent with the entire philosophy this series has been building since its very first episode, default instead to subtraction, rather than asking, what more do I need to add to make this work? They ask, what's actually in the way, and could removing that single obstacle accomplish more than adding 10 new resources ever could? He previews this with a brief illustration worth sitting with here because it sets up the next episode cleanly. Imagine leading a group of boys on a hike along a trail. Within the first mile, the group naturally spreads out, the fastest boys pulling well ahead, the slowest boy falling further and further behind, until the group isn't really a group anymore, just a long, strung-out line of individuals technically headed in the same direction. The instinctive response is to focus energy on the fastest boys, encouraging them to go even faster, because they're the most visibly impressive part of the hike. McKeown's argument, which the next episode will develop fully, is the opposite. The pace of the entire group is actually determined by the slowest hiker, not the fastest one. Removing whatever's slowing that one person down, a blister, an overloaded pack, simple discouragement, does more for the group's overall progress than any amount of additional effort poured into the hikers who were already moving quickly. Let's bring this full episode together now, because limit and buffer, despite sitting in different sections of the book, are doing closely related work. A limit protects your time and energy from being silently consumed by other people's problems, and unstructured demands the schoolyard fence, the deal breakers decided in advance, and the willingness to let other people's problems remain genuinely theirs to solve. A buffer protects that same time and energy from a different kind of threat, not other people's demands, but the predictable unpredictability of the world itself, the famine after the abundance, the project that takes longer than anyone wanted to admit, and the unexpected obstacle that arrives precisely because you assumed, optimistically, that nothing would. Both disciplines share the same underlying posture: prepare deliberately, in calm moments, rather than reacting frantically once the crisis has already arrived. Joseph didn't wait for the famine to start thinking about grain storage. The fence around the schoolyard wasn't built mid-emergency, with children already running toward the street. Both were put in place during the ordinary, unremarkable calm that precedes the moment they actually become necessary, which is, McKeown would argue, the only time real preparation is ever actually possible. The next episode moves fully into the heart of execute, subtract, progress, and the genuine mechanics of getting essential work done with minimum unnecessary friction, picking up directly from the hiking trail image that's closing this one. Episode 8, The Unfair Advantage. Let's finish the hiking image that closed the last episode, because McKeown develops it further here, and the full version is worth hearing properly. Imagine that group of boys on a trail again. Within the first mile, the group has stretched out into a long, uneven line, the fastest boys well ahead, enjoying the hike, and one boy noticeably behind everyone else, struggling, slowing the entire group's actual progress toward its destination, even though most of the boys are individually moving quite fast. McKeown borrows a name for this figure from a business novel called The Goal, by Eliyahu Goldratt, a foundational text in operations management. In that book, a factory manager is trying to understand why an entire production line keeps underperforming, despite individual machines running efficiently. He eventually realizes the answer lies with a single overweight, slow-moving Boy Scout named Herbie, leading a hiking group. In an analogy inside the novel itself, Herbie sets the pace for the entire line behind him, no matter how fast anyone else in the group is capable of moving. The factory manager applies the same insight to his production line. Rather than trying to speed up every machine in the factory simultaneously, he identifies the single machine with the largest backlog of unprocessed material sitting in front of it, the factory's own, Herbie, and focuses every available resource on improving just that one bottleneck. Once that constraint loosens, the bottleneck shifts somewhere else in the line, and he repeats the process methodically, one constraint at a time, until the entire system's output improves dramatically, not because every machine got faster, but because the system stopped being limited by its single slowest component. McKeown's question, translated directly into personal and professional life: what is the slowest hiker in your job, your project, or your life right now? What is the one obstacle that, if removed, would cause a disproportionate number of your other frustrations to simply disappear along with it? This is a fundamentally different question than the one most of us instinctively ask when we're overwhelmed. The instinctive question is almost always additive: what more do I need to do, add, or push harder on to get this done? McKeown's reframe inverts that completely: what is currently in the way, and what would happen if I focused my limited energy on removing that single obstacle, rather than adding more effort everywhere at once? He's careful to clarify what kind of removal he means, because the distinction matters. A non-essentialist, facing constant friction and obstacles, tends to respond reactively, patching one fire as it flares up, then immediately rushing to the next one, then the next, perpetually busy and perpetually behind because they're treating every obstacle as a unique emergency requiring its own improvised fix. An essentialist, by contrast, looks for the underlying constraint generating most of the friction in the first place and makes a single, deliberate, one-time investment in removing that root obstacle, understanding that solving the actual bottleneck, even though it requires more upfront thought and effort, eliminates an entire category of future fires before they ever start, rather than endlessly extinguishing them one at a time. This connects directly back to the essential intent from several episodes ago, and McKeown makes the link explicit: you genuinely cannot identify your own slowest hiker, your own real bottleneck, without first having real clarity about where you're actually trying to go. 6. If you don't know what finished or successful actually looks like for the project in front of you, you have no reliable way to judge which obstacle is the one actually worth removing versus which obstacles are simply distracting noise that happen to feel urgent in the moment. Obstacle removal without clear intent isn't an essentialist discipline, it's just another form of busy, reactive motion, dressed up in more sophisticated language. There's a reassuring practical note McKeown adds here, because the idea of identifying and removing a deep, structural bottleneck can sound intimidating, like it requires some dramatic, large-scale intervention. He's explicit that it doesn't have to. Removing an obstacle, he writes, doesn't require superhuman effort or some heroic, all-at-once push. It's closer to dislodging a boulder sitting at the top of a hill. The genuinely hard part is the very first, small push that gets it moving at all. Once the boulder starts rolling, momentum does an enormous share of the remaining work on its own. The discipline isn't really about brute force. It's about correctly identifying which boulder, of all the obstacles competing for your attention, is actually the one worth pushing in the first place. Once an obstacle has actually been identified and removed, McKeown turns to a different question: not how do you remove what's in the way, but how do you sustain genuine motivation for the essential work that remains, especially when that work is unglamorous, slow, and doesn't offer any single dramatic moment of triumph. His answer rests on a body of organizational research from Harvard Business School researchers Teresa Amabile and Stephen Kramer, who spent years studying what actually drives motivation and performance inside real workplaces, tracking detailed daily diaries from employees across dozens of projects. Their conclusion, stated plainly and quoted directly in McKeown's own text, is that of all the things that can boost emotions, motivation, and perceptions during a workday, the single most important is making progress in meaningful work. No recognition. Not financial incentive, although that matters too. Simply the felt sense of forward motion, however small, on something that actually matters. Amabile and Kramer's specific phrase for this is worth holding on to directly: everyday progress, even a small win, can make all the difference in how people feel and perform. The emphasis on small is deliberate and central to their finding. It isn't the size of the win that drives motivation. It's the simple, concrete fact of forward movement, however modest, registered consistently over time. McKeown's term for applying this insight deliberately is minimum viable progress, a phrase borrowed directly from startup culture's concept of a minimum viable product, building the smallest possible version of something that still genuinely works, rather than waiting until an enormous, perfect version is ready. Applied to your own essential work, the question becomes specific and immediately actionable: What is the smallest amount of progress that would still be genuinely useful and valuable toward the essential task in front of you right now? Not the biggest possible leap forward. The smallest one that still counts as real movement. He pairs this with a related idea: minimum viable preparation, which asks a similarly scaled-down question about getting started rather than finishing. What is the minimum amount you could do, right now, today, to begin preparing for something important, even if the actual deadline is still weeks or months away? The value of this isn't really about the specific preparation accomplished in that small session. It's about breaking the psychological barrier of not having started at all. Once something has genuinely begun, even in a small, incomplete way, the project stops being purely hypothetical and starts being something you're already, technically, in the middle of, which research consistently shows is a far easier place to sustain motivation from than the blank page starting line. McKeown also recommends visually rewarding progress wherever possible, building some kind of simple, visible tracker that lets you literally see movement accumulating over time, rather than relying purely on memory or abstract self-assessment to register that progress is happening. The mechanism here connects directly back to the Unavailable and Kramer research. If the feeling of progress is what actually drives motivation, then anything that makes progress visually undeniable, a checklist, a chart, a simple physical marker, directly reinforces the exact psychological state that sustains essential work over the long haul. There's a story McKeown includes in this part of the book that illustrates the power of small, deliberately celebrated wins in a context entirely outside business or personal productivity, and it's worth telling in full because the program behind it is real, well documented, and has since spread internationally. A Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer named Ward Clapham, working in Richmond, British Columbia, grew frustrated with how young people in his community viewed police purely as enforcers, hunters looking only for what kids were doing wrong. He created something called the Positive Tickets program. Instead of only issuing citations for bad behavior, officers were trained to actively look for young people doing something right, wearing a helmet, helping someone, or simply behaving well, and hand them a genuine ticket for it, redeemable for something small like a free movie or a meal. McKeown recounts one specific instance from the program. A teenager who had pulled a young girl out of the path of an oncoming car received a positive ticket from an officer who witnessed the act. Rather than redeeming it for the prize it offered, the boy pinned the ticket to his bedroom wall instead, keeping it as a tangible reminder that someone in a position of authority had genuinely noticed something good in him. That detail closely mirrors a separate account documented directly by Clapham himself, a different child's stepmother telling him that her son kept his own positive ticket on his wall, refusing to redeem it, because it served as proof that he was, in fact, a good kid. 16. Multiply small moments like that across thousands of interactions, sustained over years, and Clapham's program is credited with measurably shifting how an entire community of young people relate to local police, not through any single dramatic intervention but through the accumulated weight of many small, genuinely felt acknowledgments of progress and good behavior. McKeown's point in including this story here, in a chapter ostensibly about personal productivity, is that the underlying psychological mechanism is identical whether you're motivating a teenager toward better behavior or motivating yourself toward sustained essential work. Large, dramatic, occasional rewards are far less effective, across both contexts, than small, consistent, genuinely felt acknowledgments of forward movement, repeated often enough to become their own source of momentum. There's one more piece of this chapter worth covering before we close, because it bridges directly into the next episode's focus on routine and flow, and it explains why minimum viable progress works as well as it does on a mechanical, neurological level, not just a motivational one. Researchers at Duke University have found that something close to 40% of our daily choices aren't actually conscious decisions at all. They're habits, running essentially on autopilot, requiring no deliberate thought in the moment they occur. McKeown frames this finding as carrying both a danger and an opportunity, and both halves matter equally. The danger is straightforward. A huge portion of how you actually spend your days isn't the product of careful, essentialist decision-making at all. It's simply a habit, often formed without any conscious design: checking email the instant you wake up, reaching for a snack out of boredom rather than hunger, or scrolling a phone during the first idle moment of any quiet stretch. None of these was deliberately chosen as essential. They simply became automatic, somewhere along the way, often because they were easy and immediately rewarding, regardless of whether they served anything you'd actually call essential if you stopped to examine them directly. The opportunity is the same mechanism, pointed in a different direction. If roughly 40% of your day already runs on autopilot regardless of what you decide, then the genuinely strategic move isn't trying to consciously will yourself toward essential behavior moment by moment, which is exhausting and unreliable. It's deliberately designing which habits occupy that automatic 40% in the first place, building routines around your essential work so thoroughly that doing the essential thing requires no more willpower than checking a phone does for most people. McKeown draws on the journalist Charles Duhigg's well-documented framework for how habits actually form, describing a three-part loop: a cue, which is a specific trigger that tells your brain to switch into automatic mode and signals which particular habit to run; the routine itself, the actual behavior, which can be physical, mental, or emotional; and finally a reward, which tells your brain whether this particular loop is worth repeating and reinforcing going forward. Repeated enough times, McKeown notes directly, quoting Duhigg's own research, the cue and the reward become neurologically intertwined, and the entire loop becomes increasingly automatic: cue, routine, reward, cue, routine, reward, requiring less and less conscious effort each time it runs. The practical implication for an essentialist is direct. Rather than relying on motivation or discipline to get essential work done fresh every single day, design a deliberate routine around it instead. A consistent cue, a consistent time, a consistent small reward until the essential behavior itself becomes the path of least resistance, rather than something you have to consciously fight your way toward each morning. Let's bring this full episode together now, because subtract and progress are really addressing two different failure modes that both stand between intention and actual execution. Subtract addresses the obstacles already in your path: the slowest hiker, the bottleneck, the single constraint quietly limiting everything downstream of it, waiting to be identified and removed with one deliberate, well-aimed push rather than endless reactive patching. Progress addresses something different: the internal, psychological fuel required to keep moving once the major obstacles are out of the way. It's the recognition that motivation isn't primarily driven by the size of your eventual goal but by the felt, visible, repeated experience of small forward movement, registered and acknowledged consistently, the way a teenager keeps a small paper ticket pinned to his bedroom wall, not because of what it's worth but because of what it proves. Together, these two chapters complete the practical machinery of execution, clearing the path and then sustaining the energy to actually walk it, one small, deliberately celebrated step at a time. The next episode picks up directly from the habit loop discussion that's closing this one, moving fully into flow, the genius of routine and how to design the specific architecture of your days so that essential work stops requiring willpower altogether. Episode 9, The Genius of Routine. There's a specific phrase the choreographer Twyla Tharp uses to describe her own daily creative ritual that captures, more precisely than almost anything else in this entire series, what McKeown means by flow. Every morning, Tharp wakes at 5:30, puts on her workout clothes, walks outside her home in Manhattan, hails a taxi, and tells the driver to take her to a specific gym. By her own account, written directly in her book The Creative Habit, the ritual isn't the 2 hours of stretching and weight training that follow at the gym. The ritual is the cab. The moment she tells the driver where to go, in her own words, the ritual is already complete. It's worth sitting with how strange that claim sounds at first and then how precisely it captures something true. The actual creative or physical work, the dancing, the choreography, the demanding labor that produces her actual output hasn't even started yet when Tharp says the ritual is finished. What she means is that the hardest part of any difficult, essential work isn't usually the work itself. It's the decision to begin it. And by building an unbreakable, automatic chain of small actions, wake at the same time, wear the same clothes, walk the same route, hail the same kind of cab, give the same instruction, she's removed every single decision point between waking up and arriving ready to work. By the time she reaches the studio, no willpower has been spent at all. She arrives because the routine, not her motivation on any given morning, carries her there. That's the entire argument of this chapter, distilled into a single image. McKeown's claim, building directly on the cue routine reward research from the previous episode, is that the highest performing, most consistently essential people across history haven't typically relied on raw discipline or inspiration to do their important work. They've built routines specific enough that the important work becomes close to automatic, removing, as much as possible, the number of moments where conscious willpower is actually required. The historical record of how serious creative people across centuries have actually structured their days backs this up in ways that are, frankly, a little eccentric, and McKeown's broader point survives the eccentricity, because what matters isn't the specific content of any individual's routine but the sheer, unwavering consistency of it. Ludwig van Beethoven, by multiple well-documented biographical accounts, counted out exactly 60 coffee beans each morning before brewing his coffee, not approximately 60, but precisely 60, every single day, treating even that small act of food preparation as something governed by exact, repeatable ritual rather than casual variation. He developed many of his actual musical ideas while walking, a practice he maintained with the same rigid consistency as the coffee beans. Maya Angelou, the celebrated author of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, found she was fundamentally unable to write at home. As she described it in a 1983 interview, she tried to keep her home pretty, and a pretty surrounding, in her own words, threw her off entirely. 4. Her solution was specific and consistent. She rented anonymous hotel or motel rooms deliberately plain, deliberately unfamiliar, and treated them as her exclusive writing environment, stripping away every visual distraction or domestic association that might compete with the actual work in front of her. McKeown's point in citing examples like these isn't that you need to copy Beethoven's coffee bean ritual or rent a hotel room to do your own essential work. It's that each of these figures, despite working in completely different fields, arrived independently at the same underlying insight. Creativity and high performance aren't reliably summoned through sheer willpower or waiting for inspiration to strike. They're protected and reliably produced by removing as many small decisions as possible from the path leading up to the actual work, so that when the moment to perform arrives, the body and mind are already moving, already in motion, with no fresh decision required to get there. McKeown grounds this entire chapter in a specific, well-researched psychological phenomenon, decision fatigue, the finding that the quality of your decisions reliably deteriorates the more decisions you've already made earlier in the same day, regardless of how important any individual decision is. Your capacity for good judgment isn't a fixed resource available equally throughout the day. It's something closer to a battery, depleting with every choice, however small, that you consciously make. One of the more striking pieces of research McKeown points to involves judges, professionals whose decisions are, in theory, supposed to be governed entirely by the law and the specific facts of each case, with no room for something as arbitrary as the time of day. And yet, studies tracking parole board rulings have found a consistent, measurable pattern. Judges hand down meaningfully harsher rulings later in the day, after a long sequence of earlier decisions has already drawn down their mental reserves, compared to the more lenient rulings the same judges tend to issue earlier in the morning, when that reserve is fresh. The legal reasoning hadn't changed. The facts of any given case hadn't changed. What had changed was simply how many decisions that particular judge had already made that day before this one arrived. This research reframes something that might otherwise look eccentric or excessive, the well-documented habit, among several highly visible public figures, of deliberately minimizing trivial daily decisions by simplifying their wardrobe to a fixed, repeated uniform. Steve Jobs' black turtleneck, worn essentially every day for years, wasn't a fashion statement or a lack of interest in style by his own and others' accounts. It was a deliberate decision fatigue strategy, removing one small, recurring decision point from every single morning, preserving that finite reserve of good judgment for choices that actually mattered far more than which shirt to wear. McKeown extends this same logic into one of the clearest, most thoroughly documented examples in the entire book, the swimmer Michael Phelps, the most decorated Olympian in history, and the extraordinarily specific, rigidly repeated routine he followed on every single race day throughout his competitive career. The routine governed nearly everything: what time he woke, exactly what and when he ate, the precise sequence and duration of his warm-up laps in the pool, and small physical rituals performed in the same order before every major race. His longtime coach, Bob Bowman, has described the purpose of this routine directly. By the time Phelps actually reached the starting blocks, he wasn't making any decisions at all. He was simply executing a sequence he'd already run, identically, hundreds of times before, which meant his entire conscious mind, undrained by any morning decision fatigue, was available exclusively for the race itself. Observers have noted that Phelps would frequently be well into his pre-race routine before some competitors had even arrived at the pool, having already begun the automatic sequence that would carry him, without requiring fresh willpower at any point, directly into peak performance. McKeown offers several specific, practical techniques for anyone trying to build this kind of routine deliberately, rather than simply admiring it in elite performers from a distance. The first is overhauling your existing triggers, identifying a cue that currently launches a non-essential, counterproductive routine and consciously attaching a different, more essential behavior to that same cue instead. The cue itself doesn't need to change. Only what happens immediately after it does. The second is creating entirely new triggers where none currently exist, deliberately engineering a specific cue, like Tharp's taxi or Phelps' precise wake-up time, to consistently launch a new essential routine you're trying to establish, rather than hoping the routine simply happens whenever you happen to feel motivated. A third, Closely related principle is echoed across multiple productivity traditions beyond this book specifically. Do the most challenging, most essential task of the day first, before decision fatigue has had any chance to accumulate and degrade your judgment. The logic follows directly from the judge's research. Your reasoning, your discipline, and your willingness to push through difficulty are all measurably stronger early, before the day's accumulated decisions have worn them down. McKeown also recommends mixing up routines deliberately over time to avoid what he calls routine fatigue, the gradual erosion of even a well-designed routine's effectiveness once it becomes so familiar that it stops requiring genuine attention at all. And he suggests tackling new routines one at a time rather than attempting to overhaul your entire daily structure simultaneously, focusing sustained attention on a single new habit until it has genuinely become automatic before introducing the next one. McKeown grounds the broader argument of this chapter in the work of a specific, genuinely influential researcher, the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, whose decades of research into peak performance states actually gave the world the term flow in the first place, the same word that titles this chapter. Csikszentmihalyi's research into highly creative individuals across many different fields converged on a consistent pattern. Quoted directly in McKeown's own text, most creative individuals find out early what their best rhythms are for sleeping, eating, and working, and they abide by those rhythms even when it's tempting to deviate from them. They wear comfortable clothes. They interact only with people they find genuinely congenial. They devote themselves only to activities they consider truly important. That's worth holding on to as the real thesis of this entire chapter, stated by the researcher who arguably understands flow states better than anyone. Creativity and peak performance aren't typically the product of chaotic, spontaneous inspiration. They're far more often the product of an extremely disciplined, consistently protected set of conditions: sleep, food, clothing, company, and effort, all deliberately curated to remove friction and decision-making from everything that isn't the actual essential work itself. This connects every chapter of the Execute section back together into a single coherent argument, worth tracing explicitly before this episode closes. Buffer taught you to prepare deliberately for the unexpected, using calm periods to build reserve capacity before a crisis arrives. Subtract taught you to identify and remove the single bottleneck generating the most friction, rather than scattering effort across every visible obstacle. Progress taught you that small, consistently registered forward motion sustains motivation far more reliably than waiting for large, dramatic wins. And Flow, closing out this trio of execution chapters, teaches you to design the actual architecture of your days, your routines, your cues, your rhythms, so that the essential work these previous chapters helped you identify and protect doesn't require you to summon fresh willpower from scratch every single morning. McKeown is careful to note that not every routine is automatically beneficial simply because it's consistent. Some routines, formed just as unconsciously as Twyla Tharp's taxi ritual or Michael Phelps' warm-up sequence, are quietly counterproductive, like automatically reaching for a phone the moment boredom strikes or scrolling social media as a reflexive default whenever a task feels even briefly uncomfortable. The discipline this chapter calls for isn't routine for its own sake. It's a deliberate routine, consciously designed around what you've already determined, across every previous episode in this series, is actually essential, built with the same intentionality Joseph applied to grain storage, the same intentionality Beethoven applied to his coffee beans, and the same intentionality a championship swimmer applies to the exact sequence of his warm-up laps. The book's final 2 chapters, which the next 2 episodes of this series will cover, push this discipline into its last and most demanding territory. Focus asks a sharper, more immediate version of the question this entire chapter has been building toward: not what's essential across your life or your year, but what's essential right now, in this specific present moment, stripped entirely of both the regrets of the past and the anxieties of an uncertain future. And B, the book's closing chapter, asks the largest question of all, not what should an essentialist do, but who does an essentialist actually become once these disciplines have been practiced long enough to stop feeling like discipline at all and start feeling, simply, like identity. For now, the practical takeaway from this episode is direct and immediately usable. Look at your own mornings, your own evenings, the small repeated decisions scattered across your ordinary days, and ask the same question Tharp effectively answers every time she steps into that cab: what is the one small, consistent ritual that could carry me, without requiring fresh motivation each time, directly toward the work that actually matters most? Episode 10, What's Important Now? McKeown opens this chapter with a distinction borrowed from ancient Greek, and it's worth sitting with directly because it reframes something most of us experience constantly without ever naming it. The Greeks had 2 separate words for what English flattens into a single word: time. Chronos is clock time, the measurable, linear, ticking sequence of minutes and hours, identical for everyone, indifferent to what's actually happening inside any of them. Kairos is something different, a qualitative experience of time, a moment of genuine presence, depth, or significance that can't be measured on a clock at all, only felt. Two people can sit through an identical 60 minutes of Chronos, the same clock, the same duration, and experience radically different amounts of Kairos, depending entirely on how fully present they actually were inside that hour. McKeown's argument in this chapter is that an essentialist's defining skill, at the most granular level, is the ability to live inside Kairos rather than simply racing through Chronos. And the single greatest obstacle to that kind of presence, he argues, isn't external busyness at all. It's something happening entirely inside your own head. Most people spend the bulk of their mental energy either replaying the past, recent regrets, old mistakes, or conversations that didn't go the way they wanted, or rehearsing an uncertain future, worrying about what hasn't happened yet and may never happen at all. Both of those mental postures, however different they feel emotionally, share the same structural flaw. They remove you from the only moment you actually have any power to act inside, which is the present one. McKeown illustrates this with a small, personal experiment he tried with his wife, Anna, during an ordinary lunch break. The details of the exercise itself are less important than what it revealed: how much of an ordinary, supposedly relaxed conversation gets quietly consumed by attention split between the actual present moment and some other time entirely, a phone glanced at, a future commitment mentally rehearsed, or a recent frustration replayed instead of genuinely being where you currently are. The lunch wasn't unusual. That's precisely McKeown's point. Most ordinary moments are silently hijacked this way, constantly, without anyone consciously choosing it. He borrows a concrete tool for combating this from an unlikely source: legendary American college football coach Lou Holtz, who led programs including Notre Dame to a national championship across an 11-season tenure there. Holtz developed a simple acronym he used with his players, repeated constantly enough that it became something close to a team philosophy: WN, standing for what's important now. In Holtz's own words, given directly in a later interview, the strategy exists specifically to evaluate the past, focus on the future, and clarify exactly what you have to do in the present. Notice the structure of that sentence carefully: the past and future aren't ignored entirely. They're acknowledged briefly, processed, and then deliberately set aside so that the actual decision in front of you, right now, gets the full weight of your attention rather than competing against memories and anxieties that, however real, can't actually be acted on in this specific moment. McKeown's framing of the non-essentialist's relationship to time captures something many listeners will recognize immediately. Non-essentialists tend to be so consumed by past successes and failures and by future challenges and opportunities that they effectively miss the present moment entirely. They become distracted, unfocused, present in body, but functionally absent from whatever's actually happening in front of them. The way of the essentialist, by contrast, is a deliberate, repeated tuning back into the present, choosing, again and again, to experience life in Kairos, focused not on yesterday or tomorrow but specifically and only on what's truly important right now. This isn't merely a philosophical or spiritual point, disconnected from the practical disciplines covered across this entire series. It's the natural culmination of everything this series has built toward, chapter by chapter, episode by episode. You can identify your essential intent with perfect clarity. You can master discernment, trade-offs, graceful refusal, deliberate buffers, and careful routines. None of that actually matters in the only moment any of it can ever be exercised, which is always, without exception, the present one. Essentialism, at its most fundamental level, isn't a plan you make once for some future version of your life. It's a posture you either occupy or fail to occupy, moment by moment, in the only time that has ever actually existed for any of us, right now. McKeown draws a precise, important distinction in this chapter that's easy to misread at first, because it sounds almost contradictory. Multitasking itself, he argues directly, is not actually the enemy of essentialism. Pretending you can multifocus is. The difference matters more than it might initially seem. You genuinely can do more than one thing simultaneously in certain combinations. Eating dinner while having a conversation, for instance, works perfectly well because one of those activities runs largely on autopilot while the other receives your conscious attention. What you cannot do, according to the cognitive research McKeown draws on, is genuinely concentrate on two demanding things at once. You can switch your attention rapidly back and forth between a phone and a conversation, creating the illusion of doing both simultaneously, but in that switching, neither one is actually receiving your full, undivided focus. One always gets your conscious attention while the other runs in the background, however quickly you alternate between them. McKeown illustrates exactly what this looks like and what it costs with a specific, personal story from his own life and encounter, while he was still in law school, with a classmate he happened to run into. As they began talking, the classmate's phone buzzed with a text message, and without acknowledging McKeown at all, he began typing a reply, fully absorbed in his phone. McKeown simply stood there, waiting. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. The silence stretched on for a full 2 minutes before McKeown finally gave up and walked away. Some time later, that same classmate reached out to McKeown asking for help finding a job, and McKeown found himself genuinely hesitant to help, for a reason worth stating directly. If this person couldn't manage to stay present through a simple, low-stakes conversation, what confidence could McKeown have that he'd stay genuinely engaged through something higher stakes, like a job interview? The story isn't really about smartphone etiquette specifically. It's a concrete illustration of a broader pattern McKeown is asking listeners to notice in themselves. Divided attention isn't a minor inconvenience to the person on the other end of it. It's communicated, clearly and immediately, as a statement about how much that moment, and that person, actually matters to you. He offers a direct, practical technique for combating this in moments of genuine overwhelm, when too many obligations seem to be competing for attention simultaneously. Stop. Take a deliberate breath. Get fully present in the actual moment you're standing in, and ask, specifically, what is most important this very second, not what's most important tomorrow, not what felt most urgent an hour ago, but right now, in this specific instant. The question is deceptively simple, but McKeown's argument throughout this entire chapter is that simplicity is the entire point. Genuine presence doesn't require an elaborate framework. It requires returning, again and again, to a single, immediate question every time you notice your attention has drifted into the past or the future instead of staying where it actually is. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something fair that critical readers of this book have pointed out, in the interest of giving you a complete picture rather than only the book's own framing. Some reviewers have noted what looks, on its surface, like a genuine tension in the book's overall structure. For the majority of its chapters, McKeown has been urging readers toward long-term thinking, identifying a multi-year essential intent, building buffers for future contingencies, and designing routines meant to operate consistently across months and years. Then, in this chapter specifically, the emphasis shifts rather abruptly toward a present moment, almost meditative focus, without McKeown explicitly reconciling how these two modes of thinking, long-range planning and present moment immersion, are meant to work together. That's a reasonable observation, and this series won't pretend the tension doesn't exist. The most generous reading, consistent with everything McKeown has built across the rest of the book, is that the long-term clarity established in earlier chapters, your essential intent, your deal breakers, your buffers, is precisely what frees you to be genuinely present in any single moment, because you're not relying on that moment to also carry the weight of resolving your larger direction. The planning happens elsewhere, in dedicated thinking time. The present moment is then free to simply be the present moment, undivided. Before this episode closes, there's an honest admission McKeown makes that's worth carrying forward into this series' final episode, because it cuts against any impression that becoming an essentialist is a problem you eventually solve and then move past permanently. McKeown states directly, in his own writing, that he himself still struggles with essentialism regularly, despite having spent years researching, teaching, and writing an entire book about it. That admission matters more than it might first appear. This entire series has walked through 20 chapters of frameworks, real people, and concrete techniques. McKeown's own hospital story, Rosa Parks, Warren Buffett's punch card, Joseph's grain reserves, Twyla Tharp's taxi ritual, and Michael Phelps' warm-up routine. None of that adds up to a permanent cure for the pull toward overcommitment, distraction, and the undisciplined pursuit of more. It's an ongoing practice, not a destination, which is precisely the distinction the book's final chapter, which the next episode in this series covers in full, is built around. McKeown closes this particular chapter with a small, practical habit worth carrying forward on its own. Pay attention, throughout an ordinary day, for your own moments of kairos, instances of genuine presence, depth, or unexpected meaning, and write them down, briefly, in whatever journal or notebook you're already keeping. The instruction connects directly back to the journaling practice from much earlier in this series. McKeown's own habit of writing less than he feels like writing, then periodically reviewing what's accumulated. Applied here, the practice becomes a way of training your own attention to notice kairos moments more readily over time, the same way any skill sharpens with deliberate, repeated practice. He closes the chapter with a single line from Socrates that's been quoted by readers of this book more often than almost any other passage in it: "Beware the barrenness of a busy life." It's worth sitting with that phrase precisely, because barrenness is a sharper, more unsettling word than emptiness or exhaustion. A barren life isn't simply tired, it's unproductive in the deepest sense, incapable of bearing fruit, despite being filled, often to overflowing, with activity. That's the trap this entire series has been circling from its very first episode. A life can look full from the outside: packed calendar, constant motion, visible busyness, while being, in the deeper sense Socrates meant, genuinely barren, producing almost nothing of lasting value, because none of that motion was ever actually pointed at anything essential. Let's bring this episode together and, with it, draw a line connecting every execute section episode this series has covered, because focus completes something that began with buffer. Buffer prepared you for the unexpected, using calm periods to build reserve capacity ahead of a crisis. Subtracting the bottleneck standing between you and your essential work. Progress gave you the psychological fuel to sustain effort through small, consistently registered wins. Flow designed the architecture of your days so essential work could happen with minimal reliance on willpower. And focus, closing this group, brought all of that machinery to bear on the only place any of it can actually be exercised: the present moment, the single instant you're actually standing in right now, as opposed to the past you can't change or the future you can't yet control. This series has one episode left, and it's the most personal of all 20 chapters in the book. The final chapter doesn't ask what an essentialist does. It asks who an essentialist becomes, not as a set of techniques applied occasionally to a busy life, but as a complete, integrated way of being, practiced so consistently that it eventually stops feeling like effort at all and simply becomes, in McKeown's own closing words, who you are. Episode 11, The Essentialist Life. McKeown opens the final chapter of his book with a story about a coach, and it's worth knowing up front that the record involved is real and independently verifiable, not exaggerated for effect. Larry Jelwicks, who coached the rugby team at Highland High School in Salt Lake City for 36 years. Across that span, his teams won 418 games and lost only 10, capturing 20 national championships along the way. That record, by any reasonable measure, is extraordinary, not just successful, but sustained at a level that's genuinely rare across any sport, at any level, for that long a stretch of time. McKeown's interest in Jelwicks isn't really about rugby strategy, though. It's about something the coach said, repeatedly, to his players across those decades, that captures the entire argument of this closing chapter in a single sentence. He never talked to his team about winning. He talked to them about playing the game the way it was meant to be played, with full effort, full presence, and full commitment to the actual values of the sport, and trusted that if they did that consistently, the winning would take care of itself. That distinction matters enormously to how this entire series closes. 20 chapters, 11 episodes, and countless real examples: McKeown's hospital story, Rosa Parks, Joseph's grain reserves, Twyla Tharp's taxi, and Michael Phelps' warm-up routine have all been building toward frameworks, techniques, and specific tools you could pick up and apply individually. This final chapter argues something different and, in some ways, more demanding: that none of those individual techniques, used occasionally or in isolation, actually constitute essentialism in the way McKeown means it. Jelwicks's players didn't win 418 games because they occasionally remembered a few helpful rugby techniques. They won because playing the game correctly had become, for that team across 36 years, simply who they were, not a strategy applied in big moments, but an identity carried into every single moment, including the unremarkable, unwatched practices that never made it into any highlight reel. McKeown draws this into an explicit framework early in the chapter. There are two fundamentally different ways to think about essentialism itself, and the distinction between them determines whether everything covered across this entire series actually changes your life or simply becomes one more technique you occasionally remember to apply. The first way is to treat essentialism as something you do, periodically, when you remember to. In this version, essentialism is one more item added to an already overstuffed life, another tool in the toolbox, pulled out occasionally when things feel especially chaotic, then put back down once the immediate crisis passes. McKeown is blunt about why this version doesn't actually work. Adding essentialism as one more occasional practice, layered on top of everything else you're already doing, doesn't reduce the underlying overwhelm. It just adds another task to the pile. The second way, and the one this entire book has been building toward across 20 chapters, is to treat essentialism as something you are, not a technique deployed occasionally, but a complete, simpler way of doing everything, an all-encompassing approach to living that becomes, over time, the actual essence of who you are, rather than a strategy you consciously remember to apply. In this version, you don't decide each morning whether to do essentialism today. You simply are an essentialist, the same automatic, identity-level way Jelwicks's players simply played rugby correctly without needing to consciously remind themselves of the team's values before every single play. McKeown reaches back to the very beginning of the book to make this distinction land with full force, returning to the 3 false assumptions named in the opening chapter that quietly drive most non-essentialist behavior: I have to, it's all important, and I can do both. He calls these assumptions, borrowing a striking image, like mythological sirens, dangerous precisely because they're seductive, pulling you towards something that feels reasonable and responsible in the moment while quietly drowning you in shallow water over time. Living as a genuine essentialist, in the deeper sense this final chapter is reaching for, means replacing those 3 assumptions permanently, at the level of identity, with 3 corresponding truths. Not, I have to, but I choose to. Not, it's all important, but only a few things really matter. And not, I can do both, but the sharper, more honest reframe: I can do anything, but not everything. These aren't meant to be techniques you remember during moments of particular stress. They're meant to become so deeply internalized that they simply describe how you move through an ordinary Tuesday, without requiring conscious effort to access them. McKeown closes the book with an example drawn from an entirely different field than any covered so far in this series, and it's worth knowing the underlying facts are independently, extensively documented. The chef Ferran Adrià, widely regarded as one of the most influential chefs in modern culinary history, and his restaurant, El Bulli, on the coast of Spain. By any conventional business logic, El Bulli should have expanded. At its peak, the restaurant was receiving something in the range of 2 million reservation requests every single year. A conventional response to that level of demand would be to add seating, add locations, add staff, and scale the operation to capture as much of that demand as possible. Adrià did almost the precise opposite. El Bulli served only around 8,000 diners a year, roughly 50 people each night it was open, and it closed entirely for 6 months of every year. The restaurant won 3 Michelin stars and was named the best restaurant in the world a record 5 times between 2002 and 2009 by Restaurant Magazine. McKeown's point in citing Adrià isn't really about restaurant economics. It's that Adrià's signature culinary approach, taking traditional dishes and reducing them down to their absolute essence, then reimagining them entirely from that stripped-down foundation, rather than simply adding more ingredients or more complexity, is the same underlying discipline this entire book has been describing across every domain it's touched: business strategy, personal time management, creative work, and physical health. Less, but dramatically, deliberately better. McKeown traces the actual phrase, less but better, back to its source, not a productivity guru, but the German industrial designer Dieter Rams, whose minimalist design philosophy, developed during his years at the electronics company Braun starting in the 1960s, fundamentally reshaped what consumer products look like. Before Rams, radios and record players tended toward bulky, ornate, furniture-like designs. Rams' team stripped away everything that wasn't strictly necessary to the object's function, and the resulting designs were successful enough and distinctive enough that within a few years, virtually every competitor in the industry had begun imitating the same stripped-down aesthetic. Rams' own phrase for this discipline, in his native German Weniger, aber besser, translates directly to the exact phrase McKeown uses as this book's central principle: less, but better. McKeown is direct about why this principle is so difficult to actually live by, even once you've intellectually understood and agreed with it. He writes plainly, creating an essential intent is hard. It takes courage, insight, and foresight to see which activities and efforts will add up to your single highest point of contribution. It requires asking genuinely difficult questions, making real trade-offs, and exercising serious, sustained discipline to cut away the competing priorities that constantly distract from your true intention. None of that ever becomes effortless in the sense of requiring no ongoing attention. What changes, with enough sustained practice, is that the difficulty stops feeling like friction against who you are and starts feeling like the simple, natural expression of who you've become, the same way Jelwicks's rugby players, after years of consistent practice, didn't need to consciously remind themselves to play the game correctly. It had simply become how they played. McKeown gives readers a single closing instruction near the very end of the book, framed explicitly as the one thing he most hopes survives, even if every other detail from these 20 chapters eventually fades from memory. Whatever decision, challenge, or crossroads you face in your life, simply ask yourself, what is essential? Then eliminate everything else. It's worth noticing how deliberately small that final instruction is, given everything that's come before it across this entire series. 20 chapters. 11 episodes. Dozens of real people and real stories. McKeown's own hospital room, Rosa Parks on a Montgomery bus, Joseph storing grain against a coming famine, Warren Buffett's 20-slot punch card, Twyla Tharp's taxi, Michael Phelps' precise warm-up sequence, Ferran Adria closing his restaurant for half of every year despite 2 million people wanting a table. After all of that, the entire book compresses down to a single repeatable question, asked at every genuine crossroads: what is essential? And a single repeatable instruction in response: eliminate everything else. That compression is itself an act of essentialism, applied to the book about essentialism. McKeown could have closed with a longer, more elaborate summary, reviewing each chapter's individual technique one final time. He chose instead to cut all of that away, trusting that if the core question has genuinely landed across these chapters, the reader doesn't need a recap. They need one sentence small enough to actually carry into an ordinary Tuesday, an ordinary difficult conversation, or an ordinary moment of feeling pulled in 15 directions at once. McKeown is explicit, near the close of the book, about what this entire philosophy is not, because the word essentialism can be easily misread, and he doesn't want that misreading to be the thing readers carry away. This is not about going back to some simpler, earlier time. It's not about abandoning email, disconnecting entirely from modern life, or retreating into some kind of minimalist hermit existence. That would be, in his own words, backward movement. The actual project is forward-facing, applying the discipline of less but better to how we live now, inside the genuinely complicated, overcommit, opportunity-saturated world we actually live in, not some simpler world we might wish for instead. Let's bring this entire series together now, across all 11 episodes, because the through-line connecting episode 1 to this final one has been consistent the whole way, even as the specific chapters and stories changed. It started with a single moment in a hospital room, McKeown holding his newborn daughter, then leaving to attend a meeting that, by his own later account, turned out to matter to almost no one. That single bad trade-off became the seed of everything that followed, the recognition that you always have a choice, even when the world has trained you to forget that you do. From there, this series walked through discernment and trade-off, learning to see the vital few buried inside the trivial many and developing the nerve to choose between genuinely good options rather than pretending you could have them all. It moved into escape and looking, creating a literal, protected space to think and training your attention to notice what actually matters once that space exists. It covered play and sleep, protecting the only asset every other discipline in this book actually depends on, your own rested, clear mind. Then came the harder discipline of elimination, selecting with genuinely extreme criteria, clarifying a single essential intent precise enough to resolve 1,000 smaller decisions in advance, daring to say no with real grace even when every social instinct pushes toward an automatic yes, uncommitting from sunk costs once they've clearly stopped serving you, and editing your own life the way a film editor cuts away everything that doesn't serve the actual story. Finally, execution, building buffers before crisis arrives, removing the single bottleneck generating the most friction rather than scattering effort everywhere at once, sustaining motivation through small, consistently registered progress, designing routines so essential work doesn't require fresh willpower every morning, and staying genuinely present in whatever moment you're actually standing in, rather than lost in regret over the past or anxiety about a future that hasn't arrived yet. And now, here, at the close, the recognition that none of that actually works as a permanent fix, applied once and then set aside. McKeown himself admits he still struggles with all of it, regularly, despite having spent years researching, teaching, and writing the very book this series is built on. Essentialism was never meant to be a project you complete. It's a practice you return to, the same question asked again and again, at every new crossroads, for as long as you're fortunate enough to keep facing them: what is essential? And the same instruction, repeated as many times as it takes to become identity rather than effort: eliminate everything else. That's where this series ends, and where McKeown would argue your own ongoing practice actually begins, not with some dramatic, permanent transformation completed today, but with the next small, deliberate choice in front of you, made on purpose, the way every essential choice in this entire series was ultimately made, not because you had to, but because you chose to. Conclusion. The day his daughter was born, Greg McKeown left the hospital to attend a client meeting. The meeting mattered to no one. His wife noticed everything. And in that single hour handing away something irreplaceable for something worthless, McKeown found the question that would define the next decade of his life. Why do capable, intelligent, well-meaning people consistently spend their time on things that don't matter? The answer he kept arriving at wasn't a lack of talent. It wasn't laziness. It was a lack of one specific discipline, the disciplined pursuit of less. Here's the first thing you need to understand: almost none of what fills your day is actually important. Not the inbox. Not the meeting. Not the 17 priorities on the list. John Maxwell said it plainly: you cannot overestimate the unimportance of practically everything. Most of what you're doing is trivial. A very few things are vital. Learning to tell the difference, that is the entire game. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. The people who struggle most with this aren't the lazy ones. They're the capable ones. Because when you're good at something, the world rewards you with more of everything: more requests, more invitations, more opportunities, more people who need 5 minutes of your time. And more feels like winning, right up until the day you realize you're excellent at 100 things that don't matter, and you've quietly lost the 1 or 2 that do. McKeown called this the clarity paradox. Success can be a catalyst for failure. So what does an essentialist actually do differently? 3 things. Explore. Eliminate. Execute. Explore means you don't commit to everything that crosses your desk. You explore broadly, slowly, and deliberately, asking 3 questions before saying yes to anything. What do I feel deeply inspired by? What am I genuinely talented at? What meets a real need in the world? The answer that sits at the intersection of all 3, that's your essential intent. Not a vague mission statement. Something concrete enough to be measured, inspiring enough to be worth protecting. Warren Buffett said it this way: imagine you only get 20 investment decisions for your whole life. Every one of them had better count. Scarcity forces the kind of discernment that abundance never will. Apply the same logic to your time, your commitments, your relationships, and your year, and you'll make completely different choices. McKeown offers a simple rule for the borderline cases: the 90% rule. Score every opportunity from 0 to 100 against your single most important criterion. Anything below 90 becomes 0. Not a maybe. Not later. 0. Because a life full of 7s and 8s leaves no room for the rare 9 or 10 that actually deserves everything you have. Eliminate means once you've found the vital few, you dare to cut everything else, not just the obvious time wasters, but genuinely good opportunities that simply don't serve your essential intent. That's the harder version. Anyone can say no to a bad opportunity. The real discipline is saying no to a good one. And saying no is genuinely hard, for reasons that go back further than office politics. For most of human history, belonging to the group was survival. The wiring that makes you feel physical discomfort when you disappoint someone is real, ancient, and not going away. McKeown's fix is structural rather than motivational. Decide your deal breakers in advance, before any specific person's face is attached to the request. A boundary decided calmly, ahead of time, is far more durable than one you're trying to build in real time while someone is actively asking you to cross it. And when you need to walk back a commitment you've already made, the Concord principle applies. Both governments knew for years that the program would never be profitable. They kept funding it anyway, because stopping felt like admitting the investment was wasted. It wasn't. The only real waste was continuing. Admit failure to begin success. You're not married to this. Execute means once you've protected the essential, you build a system so the essential work actually gets done without requiring fresh willpower every single morning. Twyla Tharp, one of the greatest choreographers of the 20th century, wakes at 5:30, puts on her workout clothes, walks outside, and hails a cab. She says the ritual is the cab. The moment she gets in, it's over. The work is already in motion, carried not by motivation but by a routine so deeply embedded it requires no decision at all. Michael Phelps ran the same pre-race sequence identically every single time so that by the time he reached the starting blocks, every decision had already been made. That's not talent. That's the design. You have the same option. Build enough routine around your essential work that doing it becomes the default, the path of least resistance rather than the summit you have to climb fresh each day. And when things go wrong, because they will, buffer. Lincoln said, "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I'll spend the first 4 sharpening the axe." Use the good times to build a reserve for the bad. Add 50% to every timeline estimate because the research on the planning fallacy is unambiguous. Everyone underestimates, every time, in the same direction. Build the grain storage now, not during the famine. And focus. Right now. Not yesterday, not next quarter, right now. What's important now? That's it. That's the whole question. Lou Holtz used 3 letters WN to take one of the most successful college football programs in America to a national championship. The same 3 letters work equally well at a Tuesday afternoon crossroads when you can't figure out where to start. What's important now? Not everything. Not the list. Now. The philosopher Lin Yutang wrote, "The wisdom of life consists in the elimination of non-essentials." That sentence was written more than half a century ago, and it's more true now than it's ever been, because you have more options, more notifications, and more people asking for your yes than any human being in history has ever faced. Beware the barrenness of a busy life. A full life and a focused life are not the same thing. One looks impressive from the outside, busy, accomplished, in demand. The other is rarer, quieter, and built one specific way, by repeatedly, deliberately, sometimes uncomfortably choosing less so that what you keep can finally be better. McKeown closes his book with one sentence. He says he hopes you remember even if you forget everything else. It's this. Whatever decision, challenge, or crossroads you face in your life, simply ask yourself, what is essential? Then eliminate everything else. Not occasionally. Not when things get particularly overwhelming. Every time. At every crossroads. For the rest of your life. That's the book. That's the discipline. That's the whole thing.